The alarm went off at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. Not a fire alarm. Not a security breach. Just a small motion sensor tripping inside the penthouse of the Winslow Tower, the kind of alert that usually meant a cat had knocked something over. Except Harper Winslow didn't own a cat. What she owned was an 8-year-old daughter who hadn't spoken a full sentence to her mother in 6 weeks. The man who responded to that alarm wasn't a therapist, wasn't a specialist, wasn't even supposed to be on that floor. He was the janitor, and he was about to do the one thing 12 experts before him had never thought to try. He sat down on the floor and waited. If this story already has your attention, you're not alone. Thousands of viewers, just like you, have found something in these stories that stays with them long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment below. Tell us the city and country where you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. 12th caregiver quit on a Wednesday morning. Her name was Diane Cho, and she had 17 years of experience working with difficult children. That was the phrase people used. Difficult children. Though Harper Winslow had stopped using it herself after the 4th resignation letter landed on her desk. Diane left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, her handwriting neat and controlled, even as the words inside it were not. I am truly sorry. I have done everything within my professional capability. I don't believe Sophie needs a caregiver. I believe she needs something I am not trained to provide, and I don't know what that something is. Harper read the note twice. Then she set it face down on the marble counter, poured herself a cup of coffee that she didn't drink, and stood at the floor-to-soiling windows of her penthouse, watching Seattle wake up 43 floors below. She had a board meeting in 3 hours. She had a product launch in 11 days. She had a daughter sleeping behind a locked door down the hall, who had not said her mother's name in 6 weeks. Harper Winslow had built a technology company from a 2-person startup in her mid-20s into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise by the time she was 30. She understood problems. She understood that every problem had a structure, that if you broke it down far enough, if you gathered enough information and applied enough intelligence, the solution would reveal itself. She had applied that logic to Sophie's situation for 2 years. It had not worked. Sophie Winslow was 8 years old. She had her father's dark brown eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and until 26 months ago she had been the kind of child who talked constantly about dinosaurs, about the color of clouds at different times of day, about whether ants could feel surprised. She had dragged her parents to every window during rainstorms to watch the drops race down the glass. She had named the pigeons on the building's rooftop terrace. Then her father, James Winslow, had died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday afternoon in March, at 34 years old, while Sophie was at school learning long division. Nobody had seen it coming. James had been healthy, or appeared to be. He jogged every morning. He didn't smoke. The autopsy revealed a congenital abnormality that had simply never been caught, a small structural flaw in the architecture of his heart that had gone undetected through every routine physical of his adult life. Sophie had come home from school that day, expecting her father to be at the door, with the terrible knock-knock joke he told every afternoon, the one she pretended to groan at but secretly loved. Instead, there had been Harper, pale and shaking in a way that Sophie had never seen before, and the apartment had been full of people speaking in low voices, and the knock-knock joke had never come. It never came again. The changes in Sophie had not been immediate. For the first month, she had been quiet but present, following Harper through the apartment, sleeping with the lights on, asking questions that had no good answers. Where did Daddy go, exactly? Can he come back if he really wants to? Does he know where I am? Harper had answered those questions as honestly as she could, which sometimes meant saying, I don't know, and watching Sophie sit with that uncertainty the way a child sits, with a splinter pressing it carefully, testing how much it hurts. By the 3rd month, the withdrawal had begun. Sophie stopped joining Harper for breakfast. She stopped responding to tutors, not with defiance, but with a kind of total absence, sitting across from with glassy eyes, as though they were speaking a language she had temporarily forgotten how to hear. She stopped going to the rooftop to check on the pigeons. She started spending long stretches of time in the hallway closet, the one where James had kept his old sporting equipment. sitting on the floor among his baseball gloves and ski boots, and the wool peacoat he had worn every winter that still smelled faintly like him. Specialists arrived in phases. First, the grief counselors, two of them, a man and a woman who sat in the living room with careful expressions and spoke to Sophie about feelings using a vocabulary Sophie found either boring or incomprehensible. Then a behavioral therapist who spent 3 sessions attempting to construct a schedule with Sophie before Sophie methodically dismantled every printed copy of the schedule and stacked the torn pieces in a small pile on the therapist's chair. Then the caregivers, 12 and 14 months, some left after a week. Diane Cho had been the longest lasting, surviving almost 3 months before the Wednesday note. What the specialists agreed on, Sophie was not processing the loss. What they disagreed on, what to do about it. The 2 most recent recommendations had leaned towards structured behavioral programs, the kind that used reward systems and environmental controls to gradually reshape responses. One had suggested, with clinical delicacy, that Sophie might benefit from a residential program, which was the kind of phrase that sounded reasonable in a report and felt like a blade when a mother read it at midnight. Harper had rejected the residential program. She had also rejected the reward systems and the behavioral charts and the laminated visual schedules and the specific color of folder tabs that a consultant had once told her would make Sophie more receptive to routine. She had tried everything. She admitted this to no one because admitting it felt like the opening of a door she wasn't sure she could close again. Cole Barrett arrived at the Winslow Tower 6 months before the alarm. He had taken the night janitorial position because it worked with his son's school schedule. Mason was 10, mostly self-sufficient in the after-school hours, but not quite old enough for Cole to be fully comfortable with late evenings. The night shift started at 10. Mason was asleep by 9:30. It was a 2-hour window of genuine risk that Cole managed with a neighbor down the hall, Mrs. Petrakis, a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher, who considered watching over Mason a reasonable exchange for the occasional help with her grocery bags. The arrangement was imperfect. Cole knew that. Most things in his life currently were. He had been back in Seattle for 3 years, which meant he had been out of the Navy for 3 years, which meant he had spent 3 years adjusting to a life where nobody gave him a mission briefing in the morning and nobody needed him to make the kinds of decisions that other men couldn't make. He had needed time to decompress. That was the word his last commanding officer had used. Decompress, as though Cole were a piece of diving equipment being brought back to the surface too quickly. He had taken the time. It had not felt like enough, but time rarely did. His wife, Rachel, had died 18 months before his final deployment. Ovarian cancer caught late progressed fast. Mason had been 6. Cole had come home for the last 3 weeks of her life, and then, because he was a different kind of man than he was now, he had shipped out again 6 weeks after the funeral because he had not known what else to do with himself when the grief got too large. He was not proud of that. He carried it. Mason had been raised by Rachel's mother for 2 years while Cole finished his service. When Cole finally came home and took custody, Mason had been quiet for a long time, not broken, but careful. The way children get when they've learned that adults sometimes leave and don't explain why. Cole understood that kind of careful. So 3 years in Seattle, janitorial work at night. Mornings with Mason, afternoons doing the things that needed doing grocery runs. School pickups, the slow, unglamorous work of learning how to be a father who is actually present. Cooked badly and improved slowly. He forgot school project deadlines twice and was never forgiven by Mason's sense of dramatic grievance. He learned which brand of cereal Mason would eat and which he would stare at with elaborate offense. It was a small life. Cole had decided that small lives were underrated. He did not talk about his Navy career, not because he was ashamed the work had mattered, and he knew it had, but because it felt like a different person's story, and he was trying to figure out who the current person was. The Winslow Tower residential floors were quiet by 11. Corporate floors below had cleared hours earlier. Cole worked his way methodically through the common areas of the 40th through 45th floors, which included 2 sky lounges, a fitness center, and the business suites Harper Winslow's company maintained for visiting executives. He had seen Harper Winslow twice in 6 months, once in the elevator at midnight, when she had been on a phone call and nodded at him with the automatic courtesy of someone who notices other people, primarily when they're in the way, and once near the mailroom when she had been standing very still, staring at nothing in particular, and had startled when Cole came around the corner. She had apologized. He had said it was fine. That was the extent of their relationship. He knew she was the owner of the building's top 3 floors, and a significant portion of the rest of the structure, because the building manager had mentioned it during orientation in the tone of someone conveying important information. He knew she had a daughter because Mason had seen a news item about the Winslow Foundation's education grants on a school computer and mentioned it at dinner with the specific energy of a child who has acquired a piece of adult information and wants to demonstrate its weight. She's like one of the richest people in the whole state, Mason had said, with his mouth full of the pasta Cole had slightly overcooked. Don't talk with food in your mouth, Cole had said. But like billions, still your mouth. That was all Cole knew about Harper Winslow. The alarm was a soft triple tone from the penthouse sensor panel, relayed to the building's maintenance system at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October. Cole was on the 42nd floor when his maintenance receiver buzzed. The building supervisor was not reachable. He had a habit of putting his phone on silent after 10, which Cole had noted and filed, and occasionally found inconvenient. The security desk on the ground floor confirmed the alert, but reported no visible cause on the corridor cameras, and asked Cole if he could do a welfare check on his way through. Cole took the elevator to the 45th floor. The penthouse entrance was at the end of a short private corridor. The main door was closed, but not fully latched, pushed to, but not locked. The kind of almost closed that happens when someone is in a hurry, or has a small child who doesn't quite have the weight to close things properly. Cole knocked twice, identified himself through the intercom, and waited. No response from the main living area. He pushed the door gently and stepped inside. The lights in the main room were on. The kitchen lights were on. The apartment was enormous and expensive and looked, at this hour, like a place where someone had been trying very hard to make everything perfect and had not quite managed. There were architectural models on the coffee table, next to a child's sneaker. There was a whiteboard near the kitchen, covered in company diagrams that someone had attempted to erase and covered over with what looked like crayon drawings of something that might have been a city. He heard it before he saw anything. A sound from the east hallway, shallow, rapid breathing, the kind that people produce when they're trying not to make any sound at all, and are not entirely succeeding. Cole moved quietly toward it. The east hallway had 4 doors. 3 were open. The 4th, a storage room, he could tell by the absence of any light beneath it, was closed, and from behind it came that thin, frightened breathing and a small, intermittent sound that was not quite crying, more like the sound a person makes when they're concentrating very hard on holding something together that keeps threatening to come apart. He stood outside the door for a moment. He did not knock immediately. He stood there and listened to the breathing and thought about what he was dealing with. Not a medical emergency, not immediate physical danger. A child had to be the daughter, age 8, based on the sneaker on the coffee table and the crayon artwork, who had gone somewhere dark and small when the world outside felt too large and loud and uncontrollable. He had seen this before, not in children, but in grown men who had been through the kind of situations that stripped the ordinary coping mechanisms down to bare wire. Men who needed darkness and smallness and the absence of expectation in order to get through the next 10 minutes without coming apart entirely. The instinct with those men had never been to force them out. The instinct was to let them know they weren't alone in the dark. Cole sat down on the floor of the hallway. He sat with his back against the wall beside the closed door, close enough that his shoulder was maybe 18 inches from the door frame, and he spoke in a voice that was low but not whispered conversational, almost deliberately ordinary. "Hey," he said, "I'm Cole. I work in the building. I just came up to check the alarm. Everything's okay out here." Nothing from behind the door except the breathing, which had changed slightly, a small hitch in it, the recognition that someone was there. "I'm going to stay out here for a bit," he said. "You don't have to come out. You don't have to do anything. I'll just be here." He waited. The rain was coming down against the floor-to-ceiling windows at the end of the hallway. He could see the water tracking down the glass, the city lights of Seattle smearing and shifting in the wet. It was the kind of rain that had real weight to it, Pacific rain that came in from the ocean, carrying the cold of open water. "It's raining pretty hard out there. Cole said, to nobody in particular, or to the door, or to the small frightened breathing behind it. The windows on this floor catch it differently than down on 42. You can actually hear it up here, like it's close. No response. But the breathing had steadied slightly. I've got a son, Cole said. He's 10. His name's Mason. About a year after we lost his mom, he started sleeping under his bed instead of in it. He paused. Not on the floor beside the bed, fully under it, with a pillow and a flashlight and his old stuffed penguin that he would deny owning if you asked him about it today. He heard, or thought he heard, something shift behind the door. A small movement. I tried everything at first. I read books about it. I talked to people. I tried to explain why the bed was perfectly safe and the floor was dusty. Cole shook his head slowly. He'd listen to everything I said and then crawl back under the bed the next night. Very politely. Like he appreciated my input but had considered it and was declining. The breathing behind the door was slower now. More even. One night I just put my sleeping bag on the floor next to the bed, Cole said. Didn't say anything about it. Didn't explain it. Just slept there. He paused. He was back in the bed within a week. I don't know why it worked. I don't think it was anything I did, really. I think he just needed to know someone else was going to be on the floor, too. 23 minutes passed. Cole talked sometimes and was quiet sometimes. He described the rain. He described the view of the city. He mentioned that Mason had an opinion about every kind of pizza that existed and that most of those opinions were wrong. He did not ask Sophie any questions. He did not suggest she come out. He did not tell her everything was going to be fine, because he had learned a long time ago that saying everything was going to be fine was the kind of thing people said when they had run out of real things to offer. The 24th minute, the lock clicked. The door opened 3 inches. Then a little more. Sophie Winslow stood in the doorway of the dark storage room holding a baseball cap that was clearly too large for her, a man's cap, navy blue, worn at the brim in a way that suggested it had been worn a great deal and stored imperfectly and was now well past the point of ever being presentable. She was clutching it against her chest with both hands, like was the kind of thing you held onto when everything else felt like it might float away. She looked at Cole. Cole looked at her. He did not get up. He stayed on the floor of the hallway, his back against the wall, and he looked at this small girl with her father's baseball cap and her mother's stubborn jaw, and he said quietly, "Hey, Sophie." She studied him for a long moment with the particular intensity children have when they're deciding whether or not a person is safe. Then she sat down in the doorway of the storage room. Not fully out, not fully in, just sitting on the threshold, her feet on the hallway floor and her back against the doorframe. Cole did not say anything about that. He did not remark on it being progress or comment on it at all. He just shifted slightly, so his back was more comfortable against the wall, and looked out toward the rainy windows and waited. They sat together in the quiet hallway, the child in the doorway and the man on the floor, while the rain pressed against the glass, and the city glittered and shifted below them. Harper Winslow came down the hallway 7 minutes later, having returned from an emergency call to find her door unlatched and a maintenance worker's ID badge clipped to the front door handle. She stopped at the end of the hallway and saw her daughter sitting in the doorway of the storage room and a stranger sitting on the floor against the wall, and she took a breath so sharp it was almost audible. Cole turned his head slowly and looked at her. He held one finger slightly up, not a stop gesture, something smaller than that, the kind of thing that says, "Give it one more minute," and then he looked back toward the windows. Harper stood at the end of the hallway, still in her coat, her keys in her hand, and did not move. Sophie had not looked up when her mother arrived. She was looking at the rain on the windows. Now, too, the baseball cap still in her hands, her small shoulders not quite as tight as they had been 40 minutes ago. The three of them stayed like that for a while. The rain kept coming. And Harper Winslow, who had solved problems worth billions of dollars, stood at the end of her own hallway and watched a man she had never met sit on her floor and do absolutely nothing at all, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, that something might be slightly different than it had been before. She didn't know what to do with that feeling. She wasn't sure it was hope exactly. But it was something. She held her keys a little less tightly. Outside, Seattle went on being loud and lit and indifferent, the way cities do, and the rain kept hitting the glass. and nobody in that hallway said anything, and for once that felt like exactly the right amount. Harper didn't sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen after Cole had gone. He'd left quietly, the way he'd arrived, with a brief nod and a "she's okay" that managed to be both entirely accurate and somehow insufficient to describe what had just happened in that hallway. And she sat with her cold coffee and her face-down note from Diane Cho, and she tried to organize what she'd witnessed into something she could understand. Couldn't. Every specialist who had come through her door over the past 14 months had arrived with a framework, a methodology, a language full of terms like attachment disruption and avoidance behavior and graduated exposure therapy. Harper had learned all of it. She had read the books they recommended and watched the instructional videos and sat through consultations that cost more per hour than most people earned in a week. She had implemented the strategies with the dedication she brought to everything, which was considerable, and which had, in every other area of her life, produced results. The strategies had not produced results with Sophie. And then a man she had never seen before tonight had sat on her hallway floor and told her daughter a story about a stuffed penguin and a sleeping bag. And Sophie had come out of that storage room for the first time, and Harper actually had to calculate it 9 days. 9 days since Sophie had gone into the storage room during a session with the previous caregiver and refused to come out, and the caregiver had eventually called Harper at the office. And Harper had left a regional directors meeting midway through and come home and stood outside that door for 2 hours saying, "Sophie, please," in a voice that had started controlled and ended in something that frightened Harper about herself. Sophie had eventually come out on her own sometime after midnight when the apartment was quiet and had gone to bed without a word. That had been 9 days ago. Tonight, a stranger on the floor had managed it in less than half an hour. Harper got up and poured the cold coffee down the drain. She stood at the sink and looked at her own reflection in the dark window and thought, with the particular clarity that comes at 1 in the morning when the defenses are down, what am I doing wrong? She didn't have an answer. That was the part that was hardest to carry. She was not a person who typically lacked answers. She had built an entire company on the premise that problems could be solved if you were smart enough and worked hard enough and refused to accept the first several failed attempts as the final word. She had, on 3 separate occasions, turned around divisions that industry analysts had written off as unrecoverable. She had once, at 26, renegotiated a contract with a vendor 40 years her senior, who had come to the meeting fully expecting to reduce her to a footnote, and she had walked out with better terms than she'd asked for. She was good at hard things. She was apparently not good at this particular hard thing, and she didn't know how to live with that. In the morning, she asked the building manager for Cole Barrett's employment file. The manager, a nervous man named Gerald who always seemed to be in the middle of several things at once, produced it within the hour and stood in her kitchen doorway while she read it. Not much to read. Cole Barrett, 37. Previous employment listed as federal government, which Gerald explained was how military service typically appeared in standard background checks. Hired 6 months ago, no incidents, no complaints. High marks from the night supervisor for efficiency and for being, as the supervisor had written in the performance note, unusually reliable, doesn't need to be told things twice. He's a good worker, Gerald offered. I gathered that, Harper said. Closed the file. She had a board call in 20 minutes and a product sprint review after that, and 3 separate legal matters requiring her attention before the end of the week. And she sat at her kitchen table with Cole Barrett's thin employment file and did the things she almost never did. She waited. Sophie appeared in the kitchen at 8:15, which was itself unusual. Sophie had been taking breakfast alone in her room for the past 3 months, eating whatever was left on the tray outside her door with the specific self-sufficiency of someone who had decided that communal mealtimes required more than she currently had available. Came in wearing yesterday's clothes and her father's baseball cap, now on her head at a sideways angle, and she opened the refrigerator and looked at it for a while. Harper stayed very still. We don't have the orange juice, Sophie said to the refrigerator. I can add it to the grocery order, the kind without the pulp. I know which kind. Sophie closed the refrigerator. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, without turning around, the man on the floor. Is he coming back? Harper had been holding her coffee mug. She set it down carefully. I don't know. I could find out. Sophie turned around then and looked at her mother, with her father's eyes, that particular dark brown that went very direct when it wanted to, the kind of gaze that felt like it was reading something slightly behind your face rather than on it. "He didn't make me come out," she said. "No," Harper agreed. "He didn't." Sophie considered this. Then she went to the cabinet, got a granola bar, and took it back down the hallway to her room. Harper sat at the table for another minute. Then she picked up her phone and called Gerald. "I need Cole Barrett's direct contact number," she said. Cole did not answer his phone during school hours, which Harper discovered when she called at 9:15 and got voicemail. The voicemail message was brief and slightly awkward, the kind of message someone records quickly because they dislike the process. "This is Cole. Leave a message. I'll call back," and it made him seem, Harper thought, like a real person in a way that the employment file had not quite managed. Called back at 3:40. Ms. Winslow. His voice was the same as it had been in the hallway, not warm exactly, but even like something that had been calibrated to a level that didn't vary much in either direction. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for last night. I was doing a welfare check. That's part of the job. What you did wasn't part of the job." A short pause. "Is Sophie all right? She spoke to me this morning." "That's not a small thing. She hasn't been doing that much." Another pause. Longer. She got the sense he was thinking about something carefully before he said it, which was not the conversational style she encountered most often in her professional life, where people generally spoke first and refined later. "I'm glad she's okay," he said. "I'd like to offer you a position," Harper said. "Working with Sophie directly. The compensation would be—" "No," she stopped. "I appreciate it," Cole said. "But no. You haven't heard the number. The number's not the issue. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a child specialist. I don't have any training for what Sophie's going through, and if I took your money to pretend otherwise, I'd be doing her a disservice." He paused. "She needs someone qualified. I'm the janitor." Harper felt the particular frustration of someone being told something reasonable that they don't want to hear. "Every qualified person I've hired has quit. I know." "You've had 12 caregivers." She blinked. "How do you know that?" "Buildings talk," he said, which was not quite an answer. "Miss Winslow, I'm not saying I can't. I'm not saying I wouldn't spend time near Sophie if that seemed to help. But I won't take a contract for something I'm not equipped to deliver. That's not good for either of us, and it's definitely not good for her." Harper sat with this for a moment. The board call had started 4 minutes ago. Her assistant had sent 2 messages. "What are you suggesting then?" "I don't know that I'm suggesting anything. I finish my shift at 6 in the morning. I'm back at 10 at night. In between, I've got my son. That's my life." "Your afternoons," Harper said. "Excuse me?" You said you're back at 10. Your son would be in school in the afternoon. If you were willing to come by not as an employee, not as a caregiver, just present, nearby, I would pay you your standard hourly rate for building maintenance work. Call it a special project." The silence that followed was long enough that she wondered if she'd misjudged him entirely. "I'd need to be back before Mason's school lets out," he said finally. 3:15. "Of course. And I'm not going to run any kind of program with her. No schedules, no goals. I'd just be there. That's all I'm asking." "All right," Cole said. He sounded like someone agreeing to something while simultaneously reserving the right to regret it. He came the next afternoon at 1 o'clock, still in his work clothes, dark pants, a gray Henley with a small bleach stain near the collar from some maintenance job months ago that hadn't fully washed out. Harper had left instructions with the building's front desk and had taken her afternoon calls from the office 2 floors below the penthouse, which put her close enough to respond quickly and far enough away to not hover. Sophie was in the living room when Cole arrived, cross-legged on the floor near the window, with a cardboard box that had once held a printer and was now in the process of being disassembled into flat sheets. She had a pair of safety scissors and several pieces of tape and an expression of serious concentration. Cole stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the cardboard. He looked at Sophie. "What are you building?" he asked. Sophie glanced up. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "A building," she said. "What kind?" "One with a roof that works." She held up a section of cardboard that was kinked at an angle that was clearly not working. "The angle's wrong." Cole came into the room and crouched down at a reasonable distance, not crowding her, not so far away that it was performative. He looked at the cardboard. You need a steeper pitch. Sophie looked at him. What's a pitch? The angle of the roof. If it's too flat, things pile up on top. Water weight. You want it steep enough to shed. He picked up a piece of scrap cardboard from the pile beside her and folded it into a rough triangular cross-section. This, more of a V than a flat line. Sophie took it from him and looked at it and tried to replicate it with her own piece. More fold, Cole said. She adjusted it. Better. Quiet for a while. Cole sat down on the floor. He seemed entirely comfortable on floors, which Sophie appeared to notice without remarking on, and began sorting through the pile of cardboard scraps without being asked, separating larger pieces from smaller ones. You can take the bigger pieces, Sophie said, which Cole understood as an allocation of resources and accepted accordingly. Over the next 40 minutes, they built the rough framework of a building that had 2 floors, 4 walls of varying structural integrity, and a roof with a steeper pitch than Sophie's original attempt. It was not a beautiful building. The tape was visible and inconsistent. One wall leaned at an angle that suggested it had opinions about geometry. Cole reinforced it with a folded strip of cardboard at the base without comment, which Sophie watched, and then applied the same technique to the other walls without being told to. My dad used to build things, Sophie said, at some point in the second half of this. Not looking up from the tape she was applying. Not cardboard. He did woodworking. In the garage at our old house. She pressed the tape down. We don't have the garage anymore. Cole looked at the building they were making. What did he build? A shelf, and a birdhouse that the birds didn't use. A small pause. He said the birds were being rude. Cole made a sound that might have been a laugh, brief and genuine, surprised out of him rather than offered. Mason would agree with that. He takes it personally when animals don't cooperate. Sophie looked up at him then. Who's Mason? My son. He's 10. She thought about this. Is he annoying? Frequently, Cole said. Also occasionally excellent. It varies. Sophie returned to her tape. My dad would have been 36, she said, in the same tone she'd used about the birds. Matter of fact, something she'd calculated and kept somewhere. This year. Cole didn't say anything about that. He didn't say, I'm sorry, or he sounds like he was wonderful, or any of the things that adults typically said in the vicinity of that kind of statement, the things that were meant kindly and landed like stones. He just sat there, and after a moment, he picked up a piece of cardboard and started on a second building. Sophie watched him. You need a door, she said. I was getting to it. You should do the door before the roof. Otherwise, you have to cut through everything. Cole looked at what he'd made. She was right. Good call, he said. Sophie returned to her own structure with something in her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. He came back the next afternoon, and the one after that. Cardboard City grew. There was no plan to it, or rather the plan evolved daily according to whatever Sophie decided needed to be added. A park appeared on the 3rd day, constructed from green tissue paper that Sophie found in a craft supply drawer and pieces of dried pasta Cole had brought from home, because Mason had once told him that trees in cardboard cities looked better with pasta trunks, which Cole had thought was ridiculous at the time, and now found himself transmitting to the next generation. A road system materialized on the 5th day, drawn in black marker on a sheet of brown packing paper. A river appeared on day 7, which was blue cellophane from a gift bag that Harper contributed without commentary, leaving it on the kitchen counter with a note that said, "Found this." Might be useful, the first note she'd left Sophie in weeks, that wasn't about medication schedules or therapy appointments. Sophie put the cellophane river right down the center of the city. Cole built a bridge over it out of popsicle sticks. That's structurally unsound, Sophie said, the authority of someone who had been thinking about structural integrity for approximately 2 weeks. Decorative. Bridges should work. Fair point, Cole said, and rebuilt it. They rarely talked about anything of weight during these afternoons. They talked about the city. They talked about Mason's ongoing war with a specific brand of fruit snack that he considered beneath him. They talked about rain patterns and why some days the windows on the upper floors were wetter on the inside from condensation than the outside from weather. Sophie had a lot of questions about buildings, real ones. How they were made, why some lasted and some didn't, and Cole knew more than Sophie expected. which he explained was because Navy SEALs spent a lot of time thinking about the structural vulnerabilities of buildings from several different angles. Sophie had looked at him when he said that. Were you a Navy SEAL? Cole hadn't meant to say it. He'd been talking about the popsicle bridge. Yeah, he said. Like in movies? Nothing like in movies, he said, which made her laugh, the first real laugh, short and surprised, but real. He didn't say more about it, and she didn't push. But the following afternoon, she'd built a small figure out of cardboard and stood it in front of the city's largest building, and Cole hadn't asked who it was, and Sophie hadn't volunteered it, and they'd both left it there. Harper watched from a distance, which took more restraint than most things she'd managed in her adult life. She watched through the doorway sometimes, when she was home early enough. She watched Sophie's posture, the way the tight, defended set of her daughter's shoulders had started to soften slightly on the afternoons when Cole was there. She watched Sophie initiate conversation, actually initiate it, asking questions and offering opinions with the specific confidence of someone who had started to believe the person across from them wasn't going to disappear or deliver a verdict. She also watched Cole with the analytical habit she couldn't turn off even when she wanted to. She noticed that he never redirected Sophie away from topics that were hard. When Sophie mentioned her father, Cole didn't flinch or pivot or produce the careful, gentle subject change that every specialist had done. He just went where the conversation went and then came back to the cardboard buildings, and somehow that path in and out seemed safer than any deliberate route anyone had tried to construct. She asked him about it once, on a Thursday when she'd come up early and found him washing his hands in the kitchen sink after an afternoon session, Sophie back in her room. "How do you know what to do?" she said. Cole looked at her over his shoulder. "I don't, mostly. That can't be true." He dried his hands on a dish towel, her expensive dish towel, which he handled with complete unconscious disregard for its cost, which she found oddly refreshing. "When I was deployed, we had people in our units who'd been through things. Serious things. And the worst thing you could do was try to manage them through it. Give them a protocol. Make them feel like the fear was a problem to be solved." He folded the dish towel and set it on the counter. The thing that actually worked, when something worked, was just being there without an agenda. People can feel when you want something from them. Sophie can definitely feel it. Harper thought about the 12 caregivers. Specialists. Herself standing outside the storage room door, saying, "Sophie, please." "And you don't want anything from her." "I want her to be okay," Cole said. "But I'm not going to fall apart if today's not the day that happens." She can tell the difference. Harper looked at him. "How do you manage that? Not falling apart?" He seemed to consider the question seriously, rather than deflecting it. "Practice," he said. "And I've got my own stuff that taught me patience isn't the same as not caring. You can be very patient and care a lot. They're not opposites." Picked up his jacket from the kitchen chair. He was heading out. Mason's school pickup was in 40 minutes. "She built a figure," Harper said. "A cardboard figure. She put it in front of the big building." Cole paused with his jacket half on. "Yeah, she won't tell me who it is." He finished putting the jacket on. "I think you might be the building," he said. "The big one." He nodded once, in the way he did when a conversation was at a natural end. "I'll see you tomorrow." Harper stood in her kitchen for a while after the door clicked shut. She thought about what he'd said. She thought about the figure and the building and the river made of blue cellophane that her daughter had placed right down the center of the cardboard city, while Harper had been 3 floors below managing a company. Then she picked up her phone and canceled the Thursday evening call. She went down the hall and stood outside Sophie's room, and she knocked. "Yeah," Sophie said. Harper opened the door. Sophie was cross-legged on her bed with the cardboard cap that had been her father's, turning it slowly in her hands the way she did when she was thinking about something. "I thought," Harper said, and then stopped, because she didn't have a plan here, and it felt important to not perform one. "I thought I could sit with you for a bit, if that's okay." Sophie looked at her for a moment with that direct reading gaze. Then she moved over on the bed and made room. Harper sat. She didn't say anything therapeutic. She didn't introduce a subject or ask about feelings or produce a careful segue into the topic of grief. She just sat on Sophie's bed in her work clothes at 5 in the afternoon and and Sophie leaned very slightly, but actually leaned against her arm, and Harper stayed extremely still so as not to disturb whatever this was. They sat like that for almost 20 minutes. It was, Harper would think later, the longest 20 minutes she'd spent not working in the past 2 years. She was not productive during those 20 minutes. She did not solve anything. She answered no messages and made no decisions and generated no value that could be measured by any metric she used to manage her company. She thought it might have been the most important thing she'd done in months. Cardboard City continued to grow. It took up most of the living room floor by the third week, which was a problem that Harper solved by moving the coffee table to the wall, and which her housekeeper, a practical woman named Greta who had worked for Harper for 4 years, solved by learning to vacuum around it with the specific neutrality of someone who had seen wealthy people do stranger things. Cole brought supplies from the maintenance room cardboard, from deliveries, packing materials, the occasional piece of foam board that had been destined for the recycling. He never brought them as a gift or a gesture. He just put them near the city when he arrived, and Sophie would evaluate them and allocate them according to plans that existed entirely in her head and were not shared in advance. It was on a Tuesday 3 weeks into the afternoons that Sophie did the thing. She had been working on the city's central plaza, a flat area surrounded by the larger buildings, some kind of town square park space that she hadn't fully committed to yet. Cole was across the city, working on a building they decided needed a second tower, because Sophie had strong opinions about symmetry. Sophie reached into the cardboard piece pile, selected a small flat scrap, and began cutting it with the careful attention she brought to all precision work. Cut for several minutes. She folded. She added a small detail Cole couldn't quite see from where he was. Then she walked across the city, stepping over the cellophane river, with the practiced ease of someone who had made that crossing many times, and placed the small figure she'd made in the central plaza. Next to the figure that was already there, the one that had been there for 2 weeks. She'd labeled the new one. Cole saw the writing from his position, small, careful letters in the same black marker she used for the road system. Mom. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Sophie, who had returned to her side of the city, and was stick the second tower with a critical eye. The tower's leaning, she said. I know, Cole said. I'm going to brace it. You should have done the foundation first.
You're right.
He looked at the labeled figure in the plaza. Then back at the tower. I'll fix it. Sophie nodded and sat down and went back to work. Cole reached for his cardboard and started on the foundation. Outside, the rain was doing what Seattle rain did in November, arriving steadily, without drama, as if it had always been there and always would be, and the city below them went on with its ordinary business. And in the living room of the penthouse, a cardboard metropolis spread across the floor with 2 small figures standing in its center. And nobody pointed at them, and nobody made anything of them, because some things don't need to be said out loud to be entirely understood. What Cole did not know yet, could not have known, sitting on the floor of that penthouse in the quiet Tuesday afternoon, was that someone else had already noticed him. Not Sophie, not Harper. Someone who had been watching with a very different set of interests, and who had already begun to find Cole Barrett's presence in the Winslow household inconvenient. That problem was coming. It had already started its approach, the way weather moves across the water before anyone on shore has thought to look at the horizon. But on that Tuesday afternoon, the city was still growing, and the 2 figures stood in its center plaza, and Cole reinforced the leaning tower, and Sophie worked on the park, and the rain pressed against the windows 45 floors above Seattle, and none of that mattered yet. Derek Langford had a particular gift for arriving at exactly the right moment to be useful, and exactly the wrong moment to be harmless. He appeared at the penthouse on a Wednesday morning in late November, unannounced, which was his habit. Derek operated on the principle that announcing your arrival gave people time to prepare, and prepared people were harder to read. He was 51, silver-haired in the way that certain men engineered rather than simply allowed, and he had been Harper's business partner for 6 years in the specific capacity that made him difficult to remove and easy to resent. He held 19% of Winslow Technologies through a series of investment arrangements that had seemed advantageous in the company's earlier growth phase and had become progressively more complicated as the company became worth more than either of them had originally projected. Harper let him in because not letting him in would have required an explanation she didn't have the energy for that morning. She was already behind on 2 deliverables, and Sophie had woken up at 5:30 and spent an hour reorganizing sections of the cardboard city, according to a logic that Harper had not been able to follow but had learned not to question. Derek came in and looked at the cardboard city spreading across the living room floor with the expression of a man encountering something that confirms a suspicion he'd already formed. "Harper," he said, then nodding toward the city Sophie's. "Yes, it's gotten larger. That's generally what things do when they're growing." He smiled. Derek always smiled when Harper was sharp with him, which she found more irritating than if he'd reacted normally. He helped himself to coffee from the kitchen with the ease of someone who had decided a long time ago that Harper's home was an extension of their professional relationship and governed by the same access rules. "I wanted to talk about the charity gala," he said. "The venue's confirmed. December 14th. That gives us 3 weeks. I know the date, Derek, and I wanted to talk about the staffing situation." He said it to his coffee cup rather than to her. "Care situation, I should say. For Sophie." Harper turned from the window. "That's not a topic for this morning. I've been patient about it," Derek said, which was both true and delivered in a way that transformed the truth into something that felt like a threat. "But the board has questions, Harper, about your bandwidth, about whether the personal situation is creating gaps in your availability that." "My availability has not changed," she said, with the particular flatness that meant the conversation was approaching its end. "There's someone on the janitorial staff," Derek said, and the shift was so deliberate that Harper recognized it immediately. He'd been building toward this from the moment he walked in. "The gala, the board, all of it scaffolding for this. A man named Barrett, who's apparently been spending afternoons up here with Sophie." Harper looked at him. "I want to be clear that I'm raising this as a concern," Derek said, with the careful tone of some performing concern while executing something else entirely. "An unvetted maintenance employee with regular access to your daughter and your home, with no formal arrangement, no supervision structure." "He has been vetted," Harper said. "I reviewed his file personally. His file lists his previous employer as the federal government." "That's not a background check, Harper. That's a placeholder." Derek set his coffee down. "I had someone look into him. Excuse me, casually. Out of genuine concern," he paused. "He was a Navy SEAL. 12 years. 3 combat deployments. His service record as well. It's impressive if you find that sort of thing impressive. But the reason he left the Navy is not in any file I could access, and that gap is itself a flag." Harper felt the specific cold anger she experienced when someone did something calculated and framed it as care. "You had my employee investigated. I had a concern and I followed up on it. That's not unreasonable when it involves." "Sophie is my daughter," Harper said. "The decisions about who is in her life are mine to make. Not yours, of course." Another smile. "I'm just flagging that the optics are complicated. If the press gets hold of this billionaire heiress's troubled child being managed by an unqualified janitor, it becomes a story that follows the company into the ownership vote." He picked up his coffee again. "I'd prefer we get ahead of it. There's nothing to get ahead of." Then having him removed quietly shouldn't be a problem. The silence that followed was long enough that Derek had time to finish his coffee and establish, to his own satisfaction, that he had made his point. "I'll think about it," Harper said, which was what she said when she meant "get out of my house," and wanted to maintain functional ambiguity about it. Derek left satisfied, which Harper recognized as a problem. She did not tell Cole about the conversation immediately. She told herself it was because there was nothing concrete to report Derek had raised a concern. She had rejected it. End of story. She told herself this for 4 days, which was long enough for her to recognize that she was actually waiting to see what Derek would do next, before deciding how much Cole needed to know. What Derek did was talk to a journalist. Harper found out on a Monday morning when her communications director, a sharp 34-year-old named Priya, who had an almost supernatural gift for monitoring media channels, sent a message at 7:15 that said, "Heads up. Something brewing. Call me before you open any news tabs." Piece wasn't published, yet it was in the inquiry stage. The journalist reaching out for comment on what the message described as sources familiar with the Winslow household who have expressed concern about a maintenance employee's role in the care of the billionaire's daughter. The language was careful and quotationless in the way that meant whoever had talked had been careful about deniability. But the shape of it was Derek's the framing of Cole as unqualified, the implication that something was being hidden, the very specific detail about Sophie's history, with caregivers that Harper had never shared publicly and that could only have come from someone with access to the household's operational history. She sat at her desk on the 40th floor for 11 minutes, which was 9 minutes longer than she normally spent on any single problem before initiating action. Then she called Cole. He picked up on the second ring. "Ms. Winslow, there's a media situation developing," she said. "Someone has given information to a journalist about your role with Sophie. The framing is it's not favorable to you. I wanted you to know before anything is published." Pause. What kind of framing? That you're unqualified? That your presence is inappropriate? That there are questions about your military background and why you left the service? She kept her voice even, which took effort. "I believe I know who provided the information. I want you to know I intend to address it." Another pause. Longer. When Cole spoke again, his voice had not changed in volume or tone, but there was something in it she hadn't heard before, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Kind that happens not from calm, but from someone deciding how much of their reaction to allow out. "My son," he said. "What if this becomes a news story?" Mason's 10. He's at school. Kids talk. Harper had been thinking about Cole's career and her company and Derek's maneuver, and the word Mason landed at a different level entirely. "I understand," she said. "I'll do everything I can to stop this before it becomes public." "What did Derek Langford tell them?" Cole said. She was quiet for a second. "You said you know who provided the information," Cole said. "Given the board structure and the upcoming ownership vote, Langford is the obvious candidate." Harper thought of the employment file. Federal government. Doesn't need to be told things twice. "You know about the ownership vote?" "Buildings talk," he said again, the same way he'd said it before, which Harper was beginning to understand meant I pay attention, and I'm not going to explain exactly how. "What does he want?" "He wants me to remove you from Sophie's life. He's using the media as leverage." She paused. "I'm not going to do that." Harper. It was the first time he'd used her first name without the prefix. She registered it. "If it helps Sophie for me to step back." "It won't," she said, and she said it more quickly and with more certainty than she'd expected, which surprised her and apparently surprised him, because there was a pause before he answered. "All right," he said. "I need to ask you something," Harper said. "Your service record. The reason you left the Navy." Derek said there's a gap. The pause that followed this was the longest yet. She'd learned Cole's pauses somewhat. The brief ones were thinking pauses. The medium ones were deciding pauses. This one was a deciding pause that went on long enough to become its own kind of answer. "I left because of Mason," he said, finally. "After Rachel died, I went back out for one more deployment. I shouldn't have. I knew it at the time. Mason was 6, and his grandmother was good with him, but she wasn't his father, and he needed his father, and he stopped. Started again. I made a choice I've spent 3 years making up for. There's no scandal in it. There's nothing anyone could use. I just left, because it was time to be someone's father instead of something else." Harper listened to this and said nothing for a moment. "Then that's the gap. That's the gap. I'll tell Priya to prepare a response. With your permission, I'd like to characterize your background accurately: former SEAL. Community member, someone who's been helpful to Sophie in an informal capacity." "That's accurate," Cole said, "and I'd like to address Derek directly." "Call. He's your partner." "He was," Harper said, and something in the way she said it made Cole quiet on his end. The way people get quiet when they realize a decision has just been made that they hadn't expected. Harper's confrontation with Derek Langford did not happen that day. It happened 3 days later, in the Winslow Technologies boardroom on the 38th floor, in the presence of the company's general counsel and 2 independent board members, who Harper had asked to be present without fully explaining why, which she understood was a form of preemption that Derek would recognize and resent. He walked in and saw the room, and his face did the thing faces do when a plan encounters an obstacle. It hadn't modeled a brief involuntary recalibration, quickly replaced by the practiced affability. "Harper, I didn't realize this was a full session." It's not a full session. It's a conversation I wanted documented. She nodded toward the chairs. Sit down, Derek. She told him, clearly and without theatrics, that she knew he had provided information to the journalist, that she considered this a material breach of the trust that the partnership required to function, and that she would be asking the legal team to review the partnership agreement for provisions related to conduct detrimental to the company's interests. Derek listened. His expression moved through several positions: surprise, injured innocence, an attempt at counter-argument that Harper did not give him room to develop. I was protecting the company's interests, he said when she finished. That's literally my role. Your role, Harper said, is defined by the partnership agreement. Conducting independent investigations of my employees and feeding information to journalists without disclosure to me is not in that agreement. Raising concerns about operational decisions that fall within my exclusive authority is not in that agreement. She looked at him steadily. What is in the agreement is a clause about actions that create material reputational risk to the company. I'd like you to consider which side of that clause you're currently on. You're defending a janitor, Derek said, and the affability was gone now. And what was underneath it was exactly what Harper had suspected. Was underneath it a man who had decided a long time ago that Harper's competence was tolerable so long as her personal life remained manageable and her vulnerability remained available to him as a tool when he needed it. I'm defending my daughter's well-being and my authority over my own household, Harper said. The janitor, as you call him, is a separate matter. Derek looked at the general counsel. The general counsel looked at his folder. This conversation isn't over, Derek said. I expect not, Harper said. But this particular meeting is. Cole knew something about Derek's involvement by the time Harper told him the building had talked, as it did, through Gerald, the building manager, who had mentioned that one of Harper's executive guests had been asking questions about the maintenance schedule and specifically about who covered which floors. But hearing Harper describe the boardroom conversation, which she did that Thursday afternoon while Cole was doing actual building maintenance work on the 43rd floor, and she had stopped to tell him in the service corridor rather than waiting for an appropriate setting, was different from knowing it abstractly. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did. I mean, you didn't have to tell me about it. You could have handled it and said nothing. Harper considered this. She had her work phone in her hand, and she was standing in a service corridor next to a wall of electrical panels, which was not how she'd envisioned this conversation. But she'd caught Cole on his way through and started talking before she'd thought about the setting. I thought you should know, she said. You have a son. It affects him. Cole looked at her for a moment with that steady reading quality. How's Sophie? He said. The shift caught her. She's been asking about Mason. Mason? She wants to know if he's annoying. She's asked twice. Something moved across Cole's face that was close to a smile. That's her version of wanting to meet someone, I gathered. Would you be? Is that something you'd be comfortable with? Cole thought about it seriously. Mason won't treat her like a case, he said. He'll just treat her like a person, which might be good or might be a lot, depending on the day. I think she can handle a lot, Harper said. More than we've been giving her credit for. Cole nodded once. Then he said, unprompted, the thing he'd been sitting with since the phone call earlier that week. My leaving the Navy. It was the right call. I don't want you thinking there was something I wasn't discharged or disciplined. I just chose. I know, Harper said. I want to be clear about it. Cole. She said his name the way he'd said hers without the prefix the first time. I believed you the first time. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the work bag he'd set down. I'll bring Mason on Saturday, he said. If Sophie decides she doesn't want to deal with him, I'll take him home. She'll want to deal with him, Harper said. You can't know that. She's been asking if he's annoying twice a week for a month. Cole conceded this with a slight inclination of his head and went back to work. But before Saturday came Thursday, and Thursday afternoon Cole arrived at the penthouse and found Sophie in a state he hadn't seen before. Not in the storage room, not hiding. She was in the living room, sitting in the middle of the cardboard city, actually sitting in it, surrounded by buildings, the cellophane river running alongside her left knee, and she was very still in a way that was different from her usual concentration. Her hands were in her lap, The baseball cap was on her head. She wasn't doing anything. Cole put down his bag near the door and came into the room and sat down at the edge of the city, the way he always did, giving her space, not crowding. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said, to the city rather than to him. He waited. "My mom might have to go to London," Sophie said after 2 or 3 minutes. 2 weeks. For business. Cole didn't say anything immediately. "She said she hasn't decided yet," Sophie continued. "But she was on the phone about it for a long time this morning." A pause. "I heard her saying she was trying to rearrange it." "Does she usually travel that much?" "She used to." Sophie picked up a small cardboard building from beside her and turned it in her hands. "Before. She used to go somewhere almost every week. Then, after Dad, she stopped going as much." She set the building back down. "I think she's been staying because of me." Cole said nothing. "I don't want her to stay because of me," Sophie said in the voice of someone who was saying the opposite of what they meant, or maybe both things simultaneously, which is something children do before they learn to separate the contradictions. "I don't want her to go either." Cole looked at the city around them. He looked at the 2 figures in the central plaza, which Sophie had added small details to over the week's tiny features drawn in fine marker, tiny accessories constructed from even tinier scraps of cardboard. The mom figure had a briefcase now, made from a folded matchbook cover. The other figure, the one that had been there first, had a small cardboard cap. "Can I tell you something?" Cole said. Sophie looked at him. "When I was deployed overseas, in the Navy, Mason's was home with his grandmother. And every time I left, it was because the mission required it. I believed in what we were doing." He paused. "But the whole time I was gone, I was also afraid. Not of the mission, of the distance, of the idea that something could happen and I'd be too far away." Sophie was watching him with the direct attention she gave to things she considered important. "The people who wait at home feel that same distance," Cole said. "They feel it from the other direction. And the thing that nobody explains very well, that I had to figure out the hard way, is that fear doesn't mean someone's going to disappear. It just means the distance is real, and they wish it wasn't." He looked at the mom figure in the plaza. "Your mom staying home more isn't her being trapped. It's her choosing the direction she wants to move." Sophie was quiet. "But she might still have to go to London," Cole said. "And if she does, you'll still be here, and the city will still be here. And I'll still come on Tuesdays and Thursdays." "You'd still come?" Sophie said, quickly. Then, catching herself, not I was just asking." "Yeah," Cole said. "I'd still come." Sophie set the small building down carefully in its position and straightened it until it was level. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Cole said. They went back to work on the city. What Cole did not say, because some things are more useful learned than told, was what he'd actually diagnosed in those weeks of quiet afternoons and cardboard structures and rain on the windows. Sophie's fear was not, at its core, about her mother going to London. It was not even specifically about losing another person, though that was the shape the fear had taken. It was something more fundamental, the conviction, formed in the aftermath of her father's death, that the people she loved existed in a state of constant precariousness, that the world could take them without warning, without reason, without so much as a knock-knock joke as notice. No amount of reassurance addressed that fear, because reassurance operated on the premise that things could be promised, and Sophie was 8 years old and had already learned that they couldn't. What could address it was something different, evidence, accumulated slowly, that the world was not only loss, that people could leave and come back. That presence could be reliable, even when it couldn't be permanent. Cole knew this not because he was a therapist, he had said repeatedly and sincerely that he was not, but because he had spent years working with men who had learned the same fundamental lesson the hard way, men who had experienced loss and threat in concentrated form and had needed to rebuild the basic architecture of safety from the ground up. The tools were simple, almost embarrassingly simple. He started them the following Tuesday. "I want to show you something," he said when he arrived. Sophie looked up from the city with the slight suspicion she brought to statements that might be preambles to structured activities. She'd had enough structured activities to be reasonably wary of them. "It's not a game," Cole said, reading the expression accurately. "It's more like something I do when I walk into a room." "What?" Cole looked around the living room. I name 5 things I can see that are familiar. Things that were here yesterday and are still here today. He looked around. Cardboard city, the big window with the rain on it. Coffee maker in the kitchen. The sneaker by the door, same one that's been there for a week, which I'm not judging. He looked at her. Your dad's cap. Sophie reached up and touched the brim automatically. 5 familiar things, Cole said. It sounds small. It is small. But when my brain was telling me the world was completely different from one moment to the next, this reminded it that most things are still where they were. Sophie studied him. Does it work? Not always immediately. But mostly. She looked around the room with the focused attention she brought to technical problems. City, she said. The river, she pointed. The photo on that shelf. The window. The cap. Good, Cole said. That's it? That's it. He sat down at the edge of the city. You can do it anywhere. School. A crowded room. Anywhere you start to feel like things are shifting. Sophie turned this over. Then she sat down across from him and picked up her current project, which was a new building for the city's northern section. My dad used to count things, she said, while she worked. When he was nervous, he'd count things in his pockets. His keys and his phone and his wallet and whatever else was in there. What would he say when he did it? Nothing. I could see his hand moving in his pocket. And then he'd stop and he'd be fine again. She pressed a piece of tape down. I thought he was just fidgeting. Probably both, Cole said. Sophie worked in silence for a moment. I do it too sometimes, she said. With the cap. She wasn't looking at him. I hold the brim and I count the stitches on the button at the top. There are 8. Cole looked at her. Did you count them on purpose the first time? No. I just noticed. She smoothed a fold in the cardboard. But now I know. So. He understood then, something he hadn't quite put into words before. Sophie had already been finding her own way through. Imperfectly, in the dark, without knowing what she was doing, or why it helped, but finding her way nonetheless. Storage room, the counting, the cap. She had built her own toolkit from what she had available, the way people do when they're not given a better option. What she needed wasn't instruction. She needed the language for what she was already doing. And maybe someone to practice with. 8 stitches, Cole said. That's a good number to know. Sophie glanced at him sideways. You're not going to make it into a whole thing? What whole thing? Like a lesson or something. It's already something, Cole said. Doesn't need to be a lesson. She appeared to consider this and find it acceptable. They went back to building. He taught her other things, over the days that followed. Not in sessions. Not with any structure that could be identified as a program or a curriculum or anything that would have made Sophie's instincts for self-protection activate. They were embedded in the afternoons, the way the cardboard buildings were embedded in the city. You didn't always notice a new one had appeared until you looked up and saw it was there. Breathing was one. Sophie had a tendency, when anxious, to take shallow, rapid breaths that made the anxiety worse. Cole recognized it because he'd done it himself under very different circumstances. And he'd learned from a combat medic that the breath was the one physical system that operated both automatically and voluntarily, which meant it was the lever you could actually pull. He didn't explain any of that to Sophie. He just, one afternoon when she'd gotten frustrated with a structural problem and was visibly tightening, breathed out slowly and audibly and looked at the building and said, in the same tone he'd use about the pitch of a roof, try breathing out longer than you breathe in. Takes the edge off. Sophie tried it, looked skeptical. Tried it again. Huh, she said. Yeah, she filed it. Cole saw her use it twice in the next week without prompting. The exits were another. Cole had a habit, entering any room, of a brief unconscious scan, not anxious, just informational, the same way you might glance at a weather app before leaving the house. He mentioned it to Sophie when she asked why he always looked at the door first when he came in. I just like knowing where the ways out are, he said. Old habit. Why in the kind of work I used to do it mattered. But I think it's useful for everyone. Not because you need to escape, just because knowing you can makes you afraid of being somewhere. Sophie absorbed this. Like the closet, she said quietly. If I know I can go there, I don't always need to. Cole looked at her. Exactly like that, he said. You already knew. Sophie returned to the city, but something in her face had shifted the particular expression of someone who has learned that the thing they thought was weakness was actually strategy and is deciding what to do with that information. They established, without calling it anything, a small set of signals. If Sophie needed space, not frightened, just overwhelmed, which were different things that adults had been confusing, she would put her hand flat on the table. Cole would stop talking. If she needed him to keep talking because silence was currently worse than sound, she would tap once. If she was okay and just working, she did nothing. It was not a system. Cole refused to call it a system, because Sophie would have rejected a system. It was just how they operated, the way two people develop a shared language without deciding to. Harper watched this from doorways, from floors below, from the corner of the kitchen, and she felt two things simultaneously: enormous gratitude and the quiet ache of noticing how different it was from what she did, which was love Sophie completely, and still sometimes make it worse, because the love came packaged with urgency, with needing Sophie to be better, needing the problem to be solvable in ways that Sophie could feel as pressure, even when Harper was doing everything right. She mentioned this to Cole one evening in November, standing in the kitchen while Sophie was in her room. "I'm doing it wrong," Harper said, not self-pityingly. Just as an observation she'd been turning over and had decided to say out loud. Cole was washing his hands at the sink again, the same as before. Turned off the water and reached for the dish towel. "You're not doing it wrong. I love her so much that she can feel how much I need her to be okay," Harper said. And feeling that makes her feel like she's failing, which makes everything harder. Cole dried his hands and didn't answer immediately. "That's it, isn't it?" Harper said. "Yeah," he said. "A little bit. Yeah," she nodded. She'd known it before she said it, which was often how the real problems worked. You knew, and then you said it, and the saying made it solid enough to actually work with. "So how do I—" "You already started," he said. "The Tuesday night. When you went and sat with her and didn't bring anything to fix." Harper thought about that. Sophie leaning against her arm. "The 20 minutes. Do that more," Cole said. "That's all." It wasn't all, and they both knew it. Parenting never resolved into a single instruction, but it was the direction. And directions were more useful than maps when you were still figuring out the terrain. Call from the journalist came on a Friday. Priya had been running interference all week, and the piece had been delayed twice. But the journalist had found a second source, not Derek directly. Someone adjacent to Derek who had used slightly different language that was deniable in slightly different ways, and had decided he had enough to file. The piece ran on a Friday afternoon. It was not brutal. It was the kind of thing that was almost worse than brutal, careful, concerned sounding, full of phrases like "questions have been raised," and "sources close to the company suggest," and while nothing improper has been alleged. It named Cole by name. It mentioned his Navy background and described it as undisclosed. Quoted without attribution, someone describing his role as informal and unsupervised. It included a photo pulled from a building security still. Cole's back to the camera as he waited for the elevator, the kind of image that was innocuous and looked vaguely ominous at the same time. Cole saw it because Mason saw it. Mason came home from school on Friday, and he'd seen it on a classmate's parents' phone, and he'd come in and put his backpack on the kitchen chair and stood in the kitchen doorway with the expression 10-year-olds get when they're trying to figure out if they're supposed to be scared, and looked at his father and said, "Dad, people are saying stuff." Cole sat down at the table. "I know. Come here." Mason came and sat across from him, which was the thing he did when a conversation was going to be serious. Across from, not beside, so he could see his father's face. Rachel had done the same thing. Cole had never told Mason that. "There's a journalist who wrote a story about me spending time with a girl named Sophie, whose mom I work for. The story makes it sound like something it isn't." "What is it?" "Sophie lost her dad a couple years ago. She's been having a hard time. I've been around, helping when I can." Mason processed this. "Is it bad, the story?" "It's not accurate," Cole said, which was more honest than no. Mason looked at the table. "Are you going to get fired?" "I don't think so. Does Sophie know about the story?" Cole looked at his son. This was the question he hadn't thought about yet, which Mason had located in approximately 30 seconds, because Mason had a specific talent for finding the thing that mattered. "I don't know," Cole said. If someone wrote something bad about me that wasn't true, Mason said, with the careful reasoning of a 10-year-old constructing an argument, I'd want my friends to tell me before I read it somewhere. Cole looked at his son for a moment. Then he picked up his phone. He called Harper. Sophie needs to know, he said when she answered. Before she hears it from someone else. Harper was quiet for a second. Then I know. I'm figuring out I don't know how to explain this to her without it being frightening. Don't explain it, Cole said. Just tell her the truth. Someone said something untrue about someone she knows, and it's in the news, and it's going to go away, and nothing is changing. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, but that's what she needs to hear. Pause. Cole, if this gets worse, Harper. He waited until she stopped. It's not going to change what we've built with her. Stories come and go. What she and I built on Tuesday afternoons that doesn't go away because someone wrote something about it. Okay, she said. Okay, Cole said. After he hung up, Mason was still sitting across from him at the table watching. Is she going to be okay, Sophie? Yeah, Cole said. She's tougher than people have been giving her credit for. Mason nodded, the way he nodded when he was filing something for later. Can I meet her sometime? Cole almost smiled. She's been asking if you're annoying. Mason sat up straight. What did you tell her? I said it varies. That's not Dad. That's not a fair. He stopped, caught between indignation and something that Cole recognized with a complicated private warmth as interest. What did she say? Cole pushed his chair back and stood up. I'll tell you over dinner, he said. I'm making pasta. You always make pasta, 'cause it's what I can make. Come, set the table. Mason groaned and got up, the way he always did, performing inconvenience while actually being fine, and Cole stood at the stove in their small kitchen and watched the water start to heat and thought about Sophie counting stitches on a baseball cap brim, and Harper sitting on a bed for 20 minutes without a plan and a cardboard city spreading. Across an expensive floor, and somewhere in the building across town, Derek Langford was probably in a very nice restaurant, counting his advantages. Cole thought Derek was probably miscounting. The pasta water started to boil. He salted it, which was the one thing he'd learned in 3 years of mediocre cooking, was non-negotiable. Mason set the table with the haphazard efficiency of someone who considered table setting beneath his abilities, but had accepted it as one of life's small indignities. Outside, it was raining again. Seattle in November was reliable that way. Story would be in the news over the weekend, and then something else would be in the news, and it would recede, or it wouldn't, and they would deal with that when they got to it. For now, there was pasta, and a 10-year-old complaining about the fork placement rules Cole had invented specifically, because Mason's fork placement was genuinely problematic, and the rain on the window, and the ordinary Tuesday and Thursday texture of a life that Cole had, without planning to, started to value considerably more than he'd realized. He didn't know yet what December 14th would bring. But the water was boiling, and his son was setting the table badly, and for the moment, that was enough. The news piece lasted exactly 4 days before something in the financial sector knocked it off the cycle. Cole had been right about that, though being right hadn't made the 4 days particularly pleasant. Mason had fielded 2 questions at school, one from a classmate who'd seen it on his parents' phone, one from a teacher who'd pulled him aside with the careful gentleness of an adult who has read something concerning and doesn't know what to do with it, and had handled both with a composure that Cole found both proud-making and slightly heartbreaking, the composure of a child who had learned early that adults sometimes created situations that children had to navigate without adequate preparation. Sophie had handled it differently. Harper had told her on the Friday evening, sitting on Sophie's bed the way she'd started doing, without an agenda and without a script. She'd kept it simple. Someone had written something untrue about Cole. People sometimes did that. It was in the news for a few days, and then it wouldn't be, and nothing about Tuesday and Thursday afternoons was changing. Sophie had listened, with her hands around the brim of the baseball cap, turning it slowly, counting the 8 stitches, without appearing to count them. Did Cole do something wrong? Sophie asked. No, Harper said. Then why did they write it? Because it made a story. And sometimes people care more about having a story than about whether it's true. Sophie thought about this for a long time. That's a bad reason, she said. Yes, Harper agreed. It is. Sophie put the cap on. Is Cole mad? I don't think Cole gets mad the way most people do. Harper paused. He gets quiet. Sophie nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she'd already observed. He got quiet on Tuesday when the tower fell over. The big one. He just looked at it for a minute and then fixed it. Harper looked at her daughter. That's pretty much how he handles most things. I do that too, Sophie said. Get quiet, I know, Harper said. And then, because it was true, and because she had been trying to say more true things and fewer managed things, I think it's one of the things you two have in common. Sophie considered this. Then she said, Mason's coming Saturday. Still the plan. I'm not nervous. Okay. I'm not. I believe you, Harper said, which she mostly did. Mason arrived on Saturday at 11 in the morning, wearing a jacket that was slightly too big for him. Cole's hand-me-down logic applied to a child who was growing fast enough that buying things that currently fit was financially counterproductive. And carrying a remote control car that he had not been asked to bring, but had apparently decided was relevant to the visit. He stood in the penthouse doorway and looked at the cardboard city spread across the living room floor and said, with genuine feeling, whoa. Sophie was standing near the city with her arms loosely crossed, which was her version of a casual stance that was doing quite a bit of structural work underneath. She had changed her shirt twice before they arrived, which Harper had observed and not commented on. I built most of it, Sophie said, most of it, Cole said from behind Mason. You helped. I built 6 buildings and the entire bridge infrastructure. The first bridge was structurally unsound, Sophie said. The second one worked fine, because I told you to fix the foundation. Mason looked between them with the expression of someone watching a tennis match they hadn't expected to be this entertaining. Then he stepped into the room carefully, navigating around the edge of the city, and crouched down at the cellophane river. Is this the river? Yeah, Sophie said. Why is it in the middle? Cities on rivers are more interesting. The water creates problems you have to solve. Bridges, flooding, infrastructure. She said infrastructure with the ease of someone who had recently learned the word and found it useful. Flat cities are boring. Mason looked up at her. He had Cole's directness without Cole's economy. Mason delivered eye contact with more enthusiasm. Do you have cars? No. You should have cars. He held up the remote control car. It was red and had seen better days. One of the side panels was cracked, and there was a strip of electrical tape across the rear bumper that suggested a previous incident. One does 40 miles per hour. Sophie looked at the car, then at the city, then at Mason. That will destroy the buildings. Only if you drive bad. You'll drive bad. I'm actually really good. You literally just said it does 40 miles an hour. That's the max. You don't have to go 40. He said it carefully on the packing paper road system that she'd drawn along the city's main avenue. Watch. Cole stepped back and leaned against the wall near the kitchen, which was what he did at these moments, removed himself from the action, far enough to be clearly not involved, close enough to catch anything that went sideways. Harper appeared from the kitchen doorway with a coffee mug, saw his posture, and came to lean against the wall beside him. They both watched Mason navigate the remote control car down the main avenue of the cardboard city at what appeared to be approximately 3 miles per hour, with the concentration of a surgeon. Car moved past the central plaza, past the 2 small figures standing in it, rounded the curve near the northern section, and stopped neatly at the bridge. Sophie stared at him. Told you, Mason said. Sophie grabbed the remote out of his hand. Mason opened his mouth, then apparently decided to let it happen, which Cole recognized as a level of social intelligence his son had developed through a specific kind of trial and error. Sophie drove the car approximately 4 feet before it veered into the edge of a building and knocked a corner off. She went completely still. Mason reached over and picked up the corner piece. He looked at it. Easy fix, he said. You just need more tape. Cardboard's thick enough. He held it against the building experimentally. Probably should brace the whole base while we're at it. Like your other buildings. Sophie stared at the damaged corner for another second. Then she exhaled slow, longer than she breathed in, the way Cole had shown her, and said, There's tape in the drawer. Cool. Mason stood up. Which drawer? The one by the sink with the red handle. He went to get it. Sophie looked down at the building and looked at the car, and then at the remote still in her hands. She crouched down and drove the car forward to the bridge, much more slowly, and it crossed it without incident. The wall, Cole and Harper stood with their coffee, and they're quiet. He didn't make it into a whole thing, Harper said low. No, Cole said. When she knocked the building, he just fixed it, Cole said. Harper watched Sophie hand Mason the remote when he came back with the tape, watched Mason attempt to fix the building corner with less precision than Sophie would have liked, and Sophie reach over and take the tape from him and redo it with the focused attention she brought to structural integrity, and Mason watching this with a kind of frank admiration that didn't try to hide itself. She's okay, Harper said. Not as a question. She's better than okay, Cole said. She's managing someone else. That's a different gear entirely. Harper looked at him sideways. He was right. Sophie in the territory of a peer in the specific social work of managing Mason, deciding what to show him, establishing the rules, correcting the tape job was operating from a competence she hadn't seen Sophie deploy in a long time. Maybe since before James died. He's good with her, Harper said. Cole didn't say anything for a moment. Then, she's good with him too. He just doesn't know yet that she's doing it. December arrived in Seattle the way it always did, incrementally. The cold getting specific, the rain getting heavier, the sky closing down to the particular low gray that lasted until March. The Winslow Technologies Charity Gala was on the 14th, which Priya had confirmed was fully planned, catered, and sold to capacity, and which had been in preparation for 4 months and could not be moved without consequences that Harper's communications team had laid out in a document she'd read twice and found depressing both times. The gala was held in the Meridian Grand, a hotel in downtown Seattle, with a ballroom that held 400 people and a conservatory on the 3rd floor that faced north and had a glass ceiling and, on rainy evenings, produced the particular sustained sound of water on glass that Harper had always found either soothing or melancholy, depending on where she was in her life at the time she heard it. Sophie was coming. This had not been the original plan. The original plan was Sophie staying home with Greta, the housekeeper, as she had during every corporate event in the past 2 years. But Sophie had found out about the gala from Mason, who had found out from Cole, who had mentioned it in the context of explaining his schedule, and Sophie had said, at breakfast on a Thursday, in the same declarative tone she used for structural decisions about the city, I want to come to the gala. Harper had looked at her over the cereal. It's a big event. 400 people. It can get loud. I know, Sophie said. There'll be a lot of people you don't know. I know. Sophie, I want to come, Sophie said, in the tone that meant she had already decided and was now informing. I know what to do if it gets too much. I'll find a window and I'll count 5 things and I'll breathe out slow. And if that doesn't work, I'll find you. Harper looked at her daughter. Sophie looked back with her father's eyes, steady and direct. Okay, Harper said. Okay, Sophie said and went back to her cereal. Harper texted Cole from the bathroom, where she went when she needed to have a reaction without an audience. Sophie wants to come to the gala on the 14th. I said yes. His reply came 3 minutes later. Good. Then, after a pause, I'll be there anyway. Building maintenance has contracted the event venue. I'm on the facilities crew. Harper looked at this message for a moment. She typed, You're not going to tell me that's a coincidence, are you? A slightly longer pause. No, she put her phone away. She stood in her bathroom for another minute. Then she went back to the kitchen and told Sophie they would need to find her something to wear. December 14th came in cold and clear, which was its own kind of surprise. The rain had been continuous for 11 days, and then on the morning of the 14th the sky simply opened, and Seattle had the crystalline, cold, clear quality it occasionally produced in winter. The mountains visible to the east, and the water to the west, and the whole city looking like it had been rinsed and set out to dry. Sophie put on a navy dress that Harper had bought, and a pair of shoes she disliked, but wore without significant complaint, and she kept her father's baseball cap in her hand the entire car ride downtown, turning it, counting the 8 stitches, and looking out the window with the focused expression of someone who is preparing for something they've decided to do, regardless of how it feels. You don't have to stay the whole time, Harper said in the car. I know, Sophie said. If it gets to Mom. Sophie turned from the window and looked at her. I know what to do. You taught me some of it, and Cole taught me some of it. I know. Harper sat back. Okay, you worry too much. I know that too. It's not helpful. Harper looked at her daughter and felt something in her chest that was not sadness and not quite happiness, more like the recognition of a person, her daughter as a person, distinct and complicated and capable, not the extension of Harper's own fear that Sophie had sometimes accidentally become. "I'm working on it," Harper said. Sophie turned back to the window. "Good," she said. And she sounded, for a moment, so much like James that Harper had to look at her own hands for a few seconds. The gala was everything a charity gala was. Too loud, too bright, full of people in expensive clothing, saying reasonable things to each other that somehow added up to an atmosphere of mild but sustained effort. The Winslow Technologies Foundation raised money for technology education programs in underfunded schools, which was a cause Harper actually believed in, which made the evening slightly less exhausting than the ones she attended out of obligation. Sophie stayed close for the first 40 minutes. She was quiet but present. She shook hands when introduced. She answered direct questions in full sentences. She held her cap in her left hand and occasionally touched the brim with her, right in the way she'd learned, without knowing she'd learned it. Cole was visible twice in that first hour, once across the ballroom near the facilities station, in a dark jacket that was slightly better than his usual work clothes, doing something with an audio panel, once near the north corridor, talking briefly with a venue staff member. Sophie spotted him both times with the casual precision of someone who had developed a specific awareness of where certain people were in a room. "He's over there," she told Harper the second time. "I saw. Just so you know," Sophie said, which meant something more than the words. Derek Langford arrived late, which was also his habit at events, where arriving late allowed him to survey the territory before committing to a position. Harper saw him from across the ballroom and watched the brief calculation in his expression. He saw Sophie, registered her presence, and then found Harper and produced a smile that had required some assembly. Harper nodded at him from a distance. That was all. Priya appeared at Harper's elbow. "He brought Caldwell," she said quietly. Caldwell was one of the two remaining board members whose votes in the upcoming ownership meeting were genuinely uncertain. "They've been at the same table. I saw them talking before they came in." "Of course he did," Harper said. "Do you want me to—" "Not yet. Let it sit." Harper watched Derek move through the room with the practiced ease of someone who understood events as territory. "He's going to try to get Caldwell to the same conversation I'm in. He wants to use the evening. And Sophie being here?" Harper considered. "He'll see it as either an asset for him or a liability for me, depending on how she handles herself." "She's been handling herself remarkably well," Priya said. "I know," Harper said. She turned to check on Sophie. Sophie was not beside her. Harper looked left, right. The immediate circle of people she'd been standing with had shifted and redistributed the way crowds do, and the small navy-dressed figure with the baseball cap in hand was not among them. "Sophie?" Harper said, to no one in particular, and the calm in her own voice surprised her, because what was happening in her chest was not calm. She moved through the crowd. She checked the immediate area, the corridors visible from the ballroom floor, the hallway near the restrooms. The security team, too, of Harper's people, who had been briefed specifically on Sophie, were already moving at the edge of her peripheral vision, which meant they'd noticed too. One of them appeared at her shoulder, Ms. Winslow. "We don't have a visual. She's not lost." Harper said, and she believed it as she said it, which was different from how she would have said it 6 months ago. "She found somewhere. She does that," she thought. "Does this venue have she stopped?" Cole was there. He'd come from the north corridor, still in the dark jacket, and he was moving toward her with the unhurried directness he brought to everything. He stopped when he reached her. "She's not in the ballroom," Harper said. "I know." Cole looked at her steadily. "I think I know where she is." "How—" "She told me something, a few weeks ago, when I mentioned I'd be here for the facilities work. She asked me what the building was like. I described it. She asked specifically about the 3rd floor." He paused. "She asked if you could hear the rain from up there." Harper looked at him. "Harper," Cole said. "It's okay. I'll go. I'm coming." "I'm coming," she said in the tone that meant the conversation was over. The 3rd floor conservatory was a glass-roofed room originally designed as a botanical garden for the hotel's upper floors, currently repurposed into an event overflow space that was empty. Tonight the gala had filled the ballroom adequately, and the conservatory had been left open but unstaffed. It was accessed through a service stairwell at the north end of the building, which was why the security cameras hadn't caught Sophie moving through it. She'd taken the stairs rather than the elevator, which was, Cole thought as he climbed them two at a time with Harper behind him, exactly what she would do if she'd thought about it in advance. She had thought about it in advance. He was almost certain of it. The conservatory door was unlocked. Cole pushed it open. The room was dim. The building's ambient lighting came through the glass ceiling, and the clear sky had a moon in it, and the light it produced was cold and pale and completely adequate. The empty plant tables ran the length of the room. At the far end, where the glass ceiling angled down closest to the floor, and the room felt smallest and most enclosed, Sophie sat with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up and her father's baseball cap in her hands. She was not in distress. That was the first thing Cole confirmed, because it was the only thing that mattered in the first half second. She was breathing evenly. She was still. She looked, in fact, like someone who had arrived at a destination they'd been planning to reach. He did not rush across the room. He walked at a normal pace to the middle of the space and sat down on the floor there, leaving a significant distance between them. Not because she was fragile, because that was how it worked between them, always had been giving her the architecture of space and letting her decide what to do with it. "Hey," he said. "Hey," Sophie said. "You can hear it up here," he said. The rain had started again. Seattle giveth and taketh, and it was coming down on the glass ceiling in the low, continuous, textured sound that was nothing like indoor rain sounds and exactly like what it was. "Yeah," Sophie said. "You were right." He waited. "It got loud down there," Sophie said. "Not the noise, the people. All of them looking at me or at Mom or at—" She stopped and started again. "There was a man. He kept looking at me like I was—" She pressed her lips together. "Like I was a problem." "Gray hair," Cole said. "Expensive suit." Sophie looked at him. "You know him?" "I know who he is." "He's the one who wrote the stuff about you," Sophie said. It wasn't a question. He's the one who arranged it. Sophie turned the cap in her hands. One rotation. He looked at me like I was going to do something embarrassing. She looked up at the glass ceiling. I wasn't. I was fine. I was completely fine, and he was looking at me like I was about to fall apart. Cole watched her. "So I left," Sophie said with simple clarity, "because I didn't want to be looked at like that anymore. And because it started to feel too loud, the way it gets." She paused. "I used the breathing in the hallway. It helped. And then I came up here." Cole thought about the girl who had locked herself in a storage room and couldn't come out for 9 days. He thought about the progression from there to here, a child who had identified her own overwhelm, used the tools she'd accumulated, removed herself to a safe location, and was now sitting calmly in a moonlit conservatory, explaining her decision-making process with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who knows what they did and why. "That was exactly right," he said. "All of it." Sophie looked at him. "I thought you'd say I shouldn't have left." "Why would I say that?" "Because it's my mom's big event, and people will notice." "People noticing is not the most important thing," Cole said. "You knowing what you needed and doing it, that's what matters." Sophie seemed to take this in. She looked at the cap. 8, she said quietly. 8, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. Then the door opened and Harper came in. She had not stopped at the middle of the room. Cole had stopped at the middle. Harper crossed the full distance and then crouched down in front of her daughter in her gala dress on the bare floor of the conservatory and looked at Sophie for a long moment without saying anything at all. Sophie looked back. "Are you okay?" Harper said. "Yeah," Sophie said. I know," Harper said. "I know what you needed." She sat down fully. Not perched, not half-positioned. She sat down on the floor of the conservatory in her dress and her event shoes, and she didn't appear to think about it at all. "Cole said you could hear the rain up here." Sophie looked at the ceiling. "Yeah, isn't it? It really is," Harper said. They sat together, the three of them, listening to the rain on the glass, and the city was quiet in the way. Cities only get when you're high enough above them that the sound smooths out into something resembling white noise. The moon moved behind thin cloud, and the light in the conservatory shifted slightly, went softer. After a while, Sophie said, "Mom, sit with me." Harper looked at her. Sophie had moved, slightly made room against the wall beside her, the same way she'd made room on the bed that first night, the night Harper had knocked without a plan. Harper moved and sat beside her daughter with her back against the wall. Sophie leaned into her side. Not tentatively, not carefully actually leaned, the full unself-conscious lean of a child who has decided that the person beside them is where they're supposed to be. Harper put her arm around her. Cole sat in the middle of the conservatory and looked at the glass ceilings and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he understood that completely. Harper canceled the rest of the gala. Not quietly, not through an intermediary, not with a carefully worded message relayed by Priya. She went back down to the ballroom with rain still in her hair from the conservatory's imperfect seal around one of the ceiling panels, and she found the event director and said, clearly and without excessive explanation, that she was ending the evening early and would be issuing a statement about a personal matter. She found Priya and told her to handle the press release, which Priya took in stride, because Priya took everything in stride, which was why Harper paid her well. She found the 2 security staff members and thanked them and told them Sophie was fine and they were done for the evening. She did not find Derek first. Derek found her. He appeared at the edge of the corridor as she was heading back toward the stairwell, and he had the expression of a man who has watched a situation develop and is calculating in real time how to position himself relative to it. Harper, is Sophie? Sophie is fine, Harper said without slowing. I know what the press is going to do, she said. I'm handling it. If you cancel the evening, Caldwell is going to read that as instability. The vote is 3 weeks away, and Harper stopped. She turned around. Derek was 4 feet behind her, and he had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his expression arranged into something between concern and strategy, and Harper looked at him for a long moment with the clarity that comes when a situation finally becomes simple. I know what you did, she said, not just the journalist. The second source, which I couldn't prove, was you until Priya confirmed the contact timing an hour ago. I know you've been positioning the Sophie situation as evidence of my instability with every uncertain board member for the past 6 weeks. I know about the conversation with Caldwell tonight because Caldwell told me himself 40 minutes ago, because Caldwell is actually not the uncertain vote you've been assuming he is. She paused. And I know about the ownership vote strategy you filed with your attorneys last month, because your attorney and my attorney went to law school together and share certain professional courtesies when they believe one of them is about to do something significantly inadvisable. Derek's expression had gone through several positions during this. I'm not canceling this evening because Sophie disappeared, and I can't manage my family, Harper said. I'm canceling it because my daughter is upstairs, and she asked me to sit with her, and I've spent 2 years putting events before that, and I'm done. She looked at him steadily. We'll have the legal conversation next week. All the relevant parties will be present. Bring your attorney. She turned and walked back toward the stairwell. Derek did not follow. The statement Priya released that evening was clean and brief. Harper Winslow had concluded the charity gala early to attend to a personal family matter. Donations exceeded the foundation's target by 40%. The foundation thanked all attendees. No mention of Sophie, no mention of Derek, nothing that could be used or amplified. The response from the board came over the following days, not as a crisis but as something more interesting. 3 separate members contacted Harper directly, unprompted, to express support. Caldwell was one of them. He sent a brief email that said, among other things, what you did tonight was the right call. Anyone who thinks otherwise doesn't understand what leadership actually looks like. Harper read this email 4 times and did not forward it to Derek, though she thought about it. The legal review of the partnership agreement took 2 weeks. What it found was that Derek had, over the previous 8 months, engaged in a systematic campaign to position himself for a forced ownership restructuring that would have required Harper to dilute her controlling interest. The media campaign around Cole had been one piece of it, designed less to damage Cole specifically than to create a narrative of Harper's personal instability that could be cited in board discussions. The second source for the journalist had been a member of Derek's own staff, operating under his explicit direction. The partnership agreement had a clause. The legal team found it on day 3 and sent Harper a document with a single sentence highlighted in yellow. She called the lead attorney and confirmed what it meant. Then she called Priya. Set up the meeting, Harper said. Derek resigned from the partnership 6 days before the ownership vote. The terms were negotiated in a single 4-hour session, during which Harper sat across from Derek and his attorney with her own counsel, and said almost nothing, because her attorney was excellent, and because Harper had learned, from watching Cole operate, that silence was often the most efficient language. The ownership vote occurred on a Thursday in January and produced no surprises. Cole found out about Derek's resignation the same way he found out about most things related to the Winslow business. Gerald mentioned it in the lobby, while Cole was signing out at the end of a shift. "Big changes up top," Gerald said, with the satisfied tone of someone who considers themselves a reliable source. "Langford's out." "Heard it was ugly." "Heard that too," Cole said. He signed out and took the elevator down, and walked out into the January morning, which was cold and clear again, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He thought about Derek and the journalist and the photo of his back in the elevator that had run in a news piece for 4 days. He thought about Mason coming home from school with that expression. He thought about Sophie in the conservatory with the rain on the glass. He took out his phone and sent Harper a text. "Heard about Langford."
You okay?
Her reply came quickly, "Yes, better than okay." "Are you free this afternoon? Sophie wants to show you something in the city." Put his phone away. He walked to his car. He drove to Mason's school because it was a Tuesday, and Mason had track practice that let out at 3:15, and Cole had not missed a pickup in 4 months, which was not a streak he had decided to maintain, but simply something that had become how his days were shaped. Mason came out in his track clothes, carrying his backpack at an angle that suggested he'd packed it while moving, and at least 2 things inside it were in the wrong pocket. And he saw Cole and came over with the specific energy he had, after practice looser, more talkative, the residual alertness that physical effort produced. "How's Sophie?" Mason said, getting in the car. "I'm seeing her this afternoon. Tell her I figured out how to do the turn at the North Bridge without hitting the building." "I'll tell her. She didn't believe I could do it." "Can you? I need like 2 more tries." He buckled his seatbelt. "Dad." "Yeah. The thing with Mr. Langford." He had heard about it through the school's second most reliable intelligence network, which was the children of people who worked in the same industries as their parents. "Sophie's mom won?" Cole pulled out of the pickup lane. "Yes, because of what he did to you. It's more complicated than that." That was part of it. Mason was quiet for a moment, which meant he was processing. "Did you know it was going to go that way?" "No," Cole said. "Were you worried?" Cole thought about this honestly. "I was more worried about other things." "Like what?" "Like Sophie in a ballroom full of people. Like whether she was going to be okay." Mason looked at him. "She was okay. She was. Because of what you taught her. Because of what she learned," Cole said. "There's a difference." Mason appeared to consider whether there was actually a difference, and arrived at a partial agreement. "Can I come on Saturday again?" he said. "You have to ask Sophie." Sophie said yes already. She texted me. Cole looked at him briefly. "She has your number?" "She asked for it last time." "She said she needed it for logistical purposes." He said logistical purposes with precise quotation accuracy. "I think she just wanted to argue about the car." "That's very possible." "I don't mind," Mason said. "She's usually right about the car stuff." "Not that I'd say that to her." Cole drove. Sophie's something turned out to be a new section of the city. She had built it while Cole and Mason were away 3 days of work, from the evidence of the tape scraps and the scattered pencil marks on the packing paper, and it occupied the section of the city's eastern edge that had previously been undeveloped. "It was as a residential district," she explained, "because cities needed places for people to actually live, not just work and shop." And she'd been thinking about that since Mason had pointed out that the city had a lot of impressive buildings and no houses. Cole looked at it. The residential section had small buildings, not towers, not dramatic structures, just modest 2-story houses made from cereal boxes and carefully cut cardboard, lined up along a new road that connected back to the main avenue. Each one was slightly different, which Sophie had apparently taken care to ensure. Some had different roof angles. Some had different window shapes, cut out and backed with translucent paper she'd found somewhere. One had a small tree out front, made from a piece of twisted wire and torn tissue paper. "Which one's yours?" Cole asked. Sophie pointed to a house in the middle of the row. It had a blue door, colored carefully with marker, and a steep roof pitch steeper than strictly necessary, but functional. That one. Cole crouched down and looked at it. It was well made. He looked at the house beside it. And that one? That's Mason's. Cole looked at the row. He counted. How many houses are there? 8, Sophie said. He looked at the house on the other side of Sophie's. It had a slightly crooked door that appeared to have been corrected, and recorrected several times, before Sophie had accepted an acceptable approximation of straight. It was the only house in the row, with a small figure in front of it, a simple cardboard cutout, less detailed than the figures in the central plaza, more recent. Cole looked at Sophie. The door was hard to get right, she said, studying a spot on the wall to the left of his head. I had to do it 4 times. Cole looked at the figure in front of the house. He looked at the house. He looked at Sophie, who was still studying the wall with significant dedication. He did not say anything about it. He sat down on the floor of the living room next to the cardboard city and picked up a piece of scrap cardboard and a marker and started sketching the foundation for a new building that the city probably needed, on the western edge where there'd been nothing yet. What are you building? Sophie said. I'm not sure yet, Cole said. I'm starting with the foundation and seeing what it wants to be. Sophie sat down across from him, her usual position, and reached for the tape. You should know what it's going to be before you start. That's one way to do it, Cole said. It's the better way. Maybe, Cole said, or maybe sometimes you find out by building. Sophie held the tape roll. She looked at the crooked-doored house with the figure in front of it, then back at Cole, then at the foundation he was sketching. She picked up a marker. I'll do the south wall, she said. Good, Cole said. You're better at walls. Sophie did not deny this, because it was true, and Sophie was generally accurate about assessments of structural competence. She started on the south wall. The rain resumed outside, in the way Seattle rain resumed, without announcement, simply there, pressing against the windows with the patient insistence of something that had always been true and always would be. The city spread across the floor. The 2 figures stood in the central plaza. The residential district lined its new road, and in the eastern section, between Mason's house and the one with the crooked blue door, Sophie's house sat with its steep functional roof that shed water properly, and its walls that met at correct angles, and its placement at the center of everything, equidistant from the people on either side. Harper came home at 6, which was earlier than her usual 6:30, and she came in quietly and stood in the living room doorway and looked at the 2 of them working on the floor. And she didn't announce herself, and neither of them looked up. She went to the kitchen and started putting together what she had for dinner, which was not much. She hadn't shopped in 2 days, and the refrigerator was at the point where it contained possibilities rather than meals. She found pasta. She found a can of tomatoes. She found garlic and an onion, and the particular stubborn domesticity of making something from not quite enough. I can do that, Cole said from behind her. She turned. He'd come into the kitchen, leaving Sophie cross-legged with the cardboard. I'm already started, she said. You're holding the onion like it wronged you. Harper looked at the onion.
Fine.
Your knife technique is whole. Concerning is the word I was going to use. She handed him the knife, not because she couldn't do it, but because sometimes that's what you do. Took it without making anything of it and started on the onion with the efficient, unfussy competence he brought to things that needed doing and not much more. Harper leaned against the counter and watched him. Derek's really gone, she said. It wasn't a question, more like the thing you say when you're still calibrating the shape of a change. Yeah, Cole said. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would. Cole cut through the onion. What did you think it would feel like? Cleaner, she said, more resolved. Winning things usually doesn't feel as different as you thought it would. He scraped the onion into the pan. Because the actual problem wasn't Derek. Harper was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It wasn't. Sophie's the actual problem, Cole said in the tone of someone clarifying something obvious. And she's not really a problem anymore. Harper looked at the pan. She built houses today. A whole neighborhood. I know. I saw. She built you a house. Cole added the garlic. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when something was doing work inside him that he wasn't going to explain. I saw that too, he said. The garlic started to move in the pan. Kitchen smelled like something actually happening. Cole, Harper said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. Not for a specific thing, just for all of it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "The garlic's going to burn if we don't add the tomatoes." Harper turned to the cabinet for the can opener. "You're terrible at accepting gratitude." "I'm fine at accepting it. I just don't know what to do with it afterward." Harper found the can opener. She handed it to him. Their hands were briefly both on it, and neither of them moved for a second, longer than the transfer required. And then she let go and stepped back, and the tomatoes went into the pan, and Sophie called from the living room that the southeast wall of the new building was done, and Cole called back that he'd be right there, and Harper stood at the stove and stirred. And the city was spread across her living room floor, and the rain was on the windows, and everyone in the apartment was, for the moment, exactly where they were supposed to be. The school principal's name was Mrs. Okafor, and she had been calling Harper's office once a month for 18 months with the specific diplomatic patience of an educator who understands that some situations require more runway than others. The calls had always been the same in texture: careful, professional, full of the language schools use when they want to convey concern without triggering defensiveness. Sophie had not completed the day. Sophie had become overwhelmed during the lunch period. Sophie had requested to go home at 10:15, at 11, at 1:30. Calls never blamed Sophie and never quite blamed Harper either, which Harper had always recognized as a form of institutional grace that she had not always deserved. The last call from Mrs. Okafor had been in October 5 months ago. It was now the third week of March, and Harper was sitting in the second row of the East Side Preparatory School auditorium. And the seats around her were filling with parents who had the particular restless energy of people who have taken time off work for something they hope will be worth it. And on the stage behind the curtain, her daughter was preparing to speak in front of 200 people. Cole was to her left. Mason was to Cole's left, eating a granola bar with the specific focused efficiency of a boy who had decided that the 12 minutes before the program began were granola bar time and was not going to waste them. "She's going to be fine," Mason said to no one in particular. "I know," Harper said. "She practiced 4 times. "I know, I was there for 3 of them. The 4th one was just us," Mason said. "Me and her, in the city." He meant the cardboard city, which at this point occupied a permanent corner of the living room that Greta had accepted as a fixture, the way, say, she'd accepted the muddy shoes near the marble entryway and the remote control car charging station next to the kitchen island. She did it without stopping. Harper looked at him. "What did she talk about?" "Buildings," Mason said. "Architecture. How things are built so they last." He finished the granola bar and folded the wrapper with the precision of someone who has been corrected about wrapper, folding enough times that it has become automatic. "She made it about more than buildings. You'll see." Harper looked at the stage curtain. She thought about Sophie at breakfast that morning, eating her cereal without the baseball cap she'd started leaving it in her room more often over the past month, which Cole had said meant something when Harper had mentioned it, though he hadn't said what exactly, and Harper had decided not to push. Sophie had been quiet at breakfast, but not the old quiet, not the sealed-off, turned inward quiet that had lived in the apartment for 2 years. The new quiet was the kind that happens when someone is thinking rather than hiding. "She asked me this morning if I was nervous," Harper said. Cole turned from the stage to look at her. "What did you say?" "I said yes. What did she say?" Harper almost smiled. "She said I worry too much and it's not helpful." She paused. "She's told me that before." "She's not wrong," Cole said. "She gets it from James," Harper said. It came out easier than it would have 6 months ago, when his name still caught in her chest like a splinter, finding the same spot repeatedly. He used to say the same thing. Almost exactly. She looked at the curtain. "She doesn't know that." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Maybe tell her sometime." "Yeah," Harper said, "maybe." The lights in the auditorium shifted not dramatically, just a slight dimming that signaled the beginning of things, and the parents around them settled into their seats, and the murmuring lowered to an expectant quiet. And Harper's hands were in her lap, and she was aware of the distance between her left knee and Cole's right knee, which was approximately 4 inches, and had been the same 4 inches since they'd sat down. And she had been aware of it in the way you become aware of distances that feel like they carry some information you haven't quite decoded yet. Curtain moved. There were 6 students presenting. Sophie was 5th. The first four were Fina Boy, who spoke about marine biology with genuine enthusiasm that the microphone somewhat undermined, a girl who had made a model of the solar system that was technically impressive and slightly too large for the stage, two students who had collaborated on a presentation about urban water systems that Sophie had told Mason was interesting, but their bridge diagrams were wrong. Sophie walked out fifth. She was wearing the same navy dress from the gala, which she had asked to wear specifically, and she had her father's baseball cap in her left hand. Not on her head, just held loosely at her side. Her right hand was free. She crossed to the microphone and adjusted it, which took a moment because she was still 8, and the microphone stand had been set for the taller students. Teacher moved to help. Sophie held up one hand briefly clearly and adjusted it herself. Harper felt Cole shift slightly beside her. Sophie looked at the audience. 200 people, bright stage lights, the particular silence of a room, waiting to see what a child will do with the attention it's given her. She said, "I want to talk about how buildings stay standing." Her voice was clear, a little flat in the way voices are when someone is concentrating on the content rather than the delivery, which was, Harper thought, entirely Sophie. "There are 2 ways a building can fail," Sophie said. "The first way is a bad foundation. The second way is that the building can't handle what gets put on it. Weight, wind, time." She paused. Most people think buildings fail because something hits them from outside. But usually they fail from inside. A weakness that was always there, that nobody noticed until there was enough pressure. Harper was very still. "I learned about buildings from someone who knows about structural things," Sophie said. "We built a cardboard city together," which sounds like a little kid thing, but it isn't. A brief pause that had, Harper realized, been practiced. Sophie knew exactly how long to let that sit. "We built it because I needed somewhere to put things while I figured out how to carry them. And because building something, even out of cardboard, teaches you that things can be made to last if you pay attention to the right parts." Mason had stopped moving entirely beside Cole. "My dad died 2 years ago," Sophie said, with the same matter-of-fact directness she'd used since she was small, the James directness. "He was 34. I was 6. It didn't make sense, and it still doesn't, and I've stopped waiting for it to." She looked down at the cap in her hand for a moment, then back up. "What I learned is that people are like buildings. The ones that stay standing aren't the ones with no damage. They're the ones where somebody paid attention to the foundation before the pressure came." She talked for 7 more minutes. She talked about load-bearing walls, which she explained were the walls that looked ordinary from the outside, but were the ones that actually held the roof up, and about how the most important structural elements of any building were usually the ones you couldn't see from the street. She talked about the cardboard city's bridge, the one Cole had built wrong the first time, and rebuilt after she pointed out the foundation problem, and used it to explain that fixing something correctly after it fails is not failure. It's just engineering with more information. She talked about the conservatory at the Meridian Grand, though she didn't name it, describing it as a glass-roofed room where the rain sounded different, where she had gone one night when everything got too loud, and how knowing the room was there before she needed it was different from finding it by accident. The best structures, Sophie said, near the end, aren't the ones that were never damaged. They're the ones that were built by people who knew damage was coming and planned for it anyway, who put the reinforcement in before the storm, not after. She turned the cap once in her hand. "My dad was one of those people for me, and after he was gone, I had to learn to be that for myself. It took a while. It took some help." She paused. "The person who helped me isn't an architect or a therapist. He's the janitor in my building. And what he taught me is that the most important thing in any structure isn't what it's made of. It's whether it has someone paying attention to it." She looked out at the audience. "That's all," she said. She adjusted the microphone back to its original height with the same deliberate care she'd used to lower it, picked up her note cards from the podium, and walked off the stage. The applause started before she was fully clear of the curtain. Harper was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. Cole stood half a second later. Mason was already standing, because he had been gradually rising through the last 3 minutes the way a person does when they forget to stay seated. Harper was clapping, and she was also, with the specific efficiency of someone who manages public appearances professionally, managing her face which was doing several things simultaneously that she had not authorized. Cole stood beside her and clapped and said nothing, which was the right thing. She's better at speeches than me, Mason said loudly over the applause. I'm not even mad about it. Sophie came out of the backstage area 10 minutes later, through a side door, and she had the cap on now on her head, the brim slightly sideways the way she wore it when she wasn't thinking about it. She saw them across the lobby and came over directly, navigating through the congratulating parents and the milling students with the specific certainty of someone moving toward a known destination. She reached them and looked at Harper. Harper looked at her. Well, Sophie said. Well, Harper said, and her voice was not entirely stable, which Sophie observed with the focused attention she gave to things she was assessing. You were extraordinary. Sophie appeared to accept this as accurate rather than parental inflation. The solar system model was better, technically, she said. But my content was stronger, indisputably, Harper said. Sophie turned to Cole. She looked at him with the direct reading gaze that had always reminded Harper of James, and Cole looked back at her with the steady, even quality that was entirely his own. And something passed between them that Harper could see, but not quite name the specific recognition of two people who have spent a significant number of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons on a floor, together, building something out of nothing, and understand each other in the particular way that activity produces. The foundation thing, Cole said. That was good. It's accurate, Sophie said. Yeah, it is. I cited the bridge as a negative example, Sophie said. I hope that's okay. Which bridge? The first one you built. Structurally unsound one. You didn't name me. I said, someone who knows about structural things. A pause. Which is only partly true. You also know about structural things. Cole made the sound that was almost a laugh. Sophie watched him do it with the expression of someone who has learned exactly how to produce that reaction and finds it worthwhile. Mason had been waiting with the patience of someone who has learned that sometimes adults and Sophie need a moment before the conversation opens up. You said I was your best friend, he said when there was a gap, basically, in the speech. Sophie turned to him. I said I had help. You said, some help, plural. Plural includes you. Yeah, but who else? Because I was definitely first. You were definitely not first. Cole was first. My mom was second. You were third, Mason said flatly. Significant third, Sophie said, which she appeared to have prepared, because she delivered it with the cadence of something that had been workshopped. Mason looked at Cole. She made up a ranking. She's made up rankings before, Cole said. Remember the pizza ranking? The pizza ranking was scientifically accurate, Sophie said. You ranked cheese pizza above pepperoni, Mason said. That's not science, that's a character flaw. Sophie adjusted the brim of her cap. The structural integrity of the cheese distribution is objectively superior. The most ridiculous thing. Harper laughed. Not the managed social laugh she produced at company events. Not the slightly delayed laugh of someone performing amusement. A real laugh, sudden and complete, at the specific absurdity of standing in a school lobby after her daughter's extraordinary speech listening to a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old argue about pizza taxonomy. Cole looked at her when she laughed, and he had an expression she didn't often see on him, unguarded, warm, the look of someone watching something they're glad is happening. Caught him looking. He didn't look away. Can we get lunch? Mason said. Sophie's speech made me hungry. Speeches don't make people hungry, Sophie said. Listening to speeches does. It takes energy. That's not how. Cole, tell her. I'm not getting involved, Cole said. You always say that, and then you always have an opinion. I have an opinion about the pizza ranking, Cole said. Pepperoni is correct. Sophie pointed at him. You're compromised by bias. Can we please get lunch, Mason said. They got lunch. It was a diner 4 blocks from the school, the kind with laminated menus and a counter along one wall, and a specific smell of coffee that had been brewing since before most of the current customers were born. They took a booth, Sophie and Mason on one side, conducting an ongoing archaeological dispute about the menu's dessert section, Harper and Cole on the other. The diner was loud in the good way, actual noise, actual people, the ambient evidence of ordinary life proceeding without particular drama. Harper noticed, as she sometimes noticed now, that Sophie had not tensed when they walked in, had done the brief room orientation thing, the almost imperceptible glance at the exits and windows, then sat down and opened the menu and started arguing about pie. 6 months ago, a loud diner would have been out of the question. She mentioned this to Cole while Sophie and Mason were debating with impressive intensity whether banana cream or cherry was the objectively superior pie, conversation that had the quality of something they'd had before and were refining rather than beginning. She adjusted in about 15 seconds, Harper said, low enough that it was between them. Cole looked at Sophie. She does that now. Most places. What changed? Nothing changed, Cole said. She added tools. She has more options for what to do when it gets hard, so it gets hard less often. And when it does, she knows she can handle it. He looked at the menu. She's not fearless. She's just less afraid of being afraid. Harper turned this over. It was one of those things that sounded simple and wasn't. The kind of thing that took real time to understand the difference between. I've been thinking about something, Harper said. Program. Using the foundation money, there's discretionary capacity in the foundation's annual budget that I've been underutilizing. She paused. For families. Specifically children who've had a significant loss and the parents who are trying to figure out how to help them. Veterans who understand trauma. Widowed parents. Counselors who know the difference between a child who needs management and a child who needs what Sophie needed. Cole looked up from the menu. I'd want you involved, Harper said. As an advisor. Not full-time, not a career change. Just your perspective, your experience, what you figured out on a hallway floor. Cole was quiet for a moment. You don't have to decide now, Harper said. I know. He set the menu down. What would that look like, practically? Quarterly. Maybe monthly during the design phase. You'd help us understand what actually works versus what sounds like it should work. Which are very different things, Cole said. Extremely different things, Harper agreed. He thought about it with the deliberateness he brought to most things that mattered. I'd want it to be honest, he said. Not a PR program. Not something that exists to make the foundation look good. That's what I want too. And I'd want to talk to some of the families directly. Not consult about them from a conference room. I'd expect nothing else, Harper said. Cole picked up his coffee. He looked at Sophie, who was now explaining to Mason the structural requirements of a proper pie crust with the same authority she applied to cardboard foundations. He looked at Harper. Okay, he said. Yeah. He drank the coffee. I'm in. Harper felt the specific satisfaction of a thing that has been thought about for a long time and has finally been said, which is different from the satisfaction of winning or deciding, more like relief, but the kind that comes from rightness rather than release. Dad, Mason said, across the table. Yeah. Sophie says banana cream is better than cherry, and I need you to settle this. I already told you I'm not getting involved. You said that about the pizza, too. Cherry, Cole said. Sophie pointed at him again. Bias. I like cherries. That's not a structural argument. It doesn't have to be. Everything is a structural argument if you think about it correctly. Sophie said, with the serene certainty of someone who has arrived at a philosophical position and considers it settled. The diner noise went on around them. The coffee was refilled by a server who had the practiced efficiency of someone who has worked the lunch rush long enough to read a table from 12 feet away. Outside, Seattle was doing what it did in March, a pale, uncertain sun making its case against the clouds, winning about half the time. The Winslow Family Support Initiative launched in September. It wasn't called that at first. The working name, during the 8 months of development, had been considerably more bureaucratic, involving the word framework twice, which Harper's foundation director said tested well with institutional donors, and which Harper had allowed until the month before launch when she replaced it with something that meant what it actually was. The initiative paired bereaved families, primarily those with children between 5 and 12, who had experienced sudden or traumatic loss, with a team that included grief counselors, veteran mentors, and peer support facilitators who had been through their own version of the same thing and had come out the other side. The matching was careful and specific because Cole had said in the first design meeting that the most important thing was not giving families help, but giving them the right help, which were different problems and required different solutions. What Sophie needed, he had said, in that first meeting, to a room of foundation staff and counselors and one very attentive social worker named Dr. Amara Osi, who would eventually become the program's clinical director, was not therapy. Proximity. Someone nearby who wasn't there to fix her. Not everyone needs the same thing, and the mistake is assuming they do. Dr. Osi had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "That is simultaneously the most obvious and most consistently ignored insight in trauma support." She'd clicked her pen. "Tell me more." Cole had told her more for 2 hours, with the slightly uncomfortable manner of someone who is fluent in a subject they've never considered themselves expert in and is navigating the gap between knowing things and being credentialed to say them. Dr. Osi had listened with the focused attention of someone stripping a thing to its framework and rebuilding it in a usable form. The program's first cohort was 12 families. By the end of the first year, it was 31. By the second year, it had a wait list. Cole attended the quarterly advisory meetings and said less than anyone else in the room and was invariably the person whose observations reoriented the most subsequent discussion. He remained, through all of it, the janitor at Winslow Tower, a fact that the Foundation's communications team had initially found awkward to explain and eventually found was the most useful thing they could say about the program's origins. Because it was true, and truth, handled correctly, was better than any narrative they could have constructed. Sophie turned 9 in April, 4 months after the school presentation. She wanted a small party, which was a revision of her previous position. For 2 years she had declined birthday celebrations entirely, had spent her 7th birthday in her room and her 8th at the city's edge watching rain on the window, and Harper had not pushed either time, had let the days pass without making them into something Sophie wasn't ready for them to be. The 9th birthday party was 7 people: Harper, Cole, Mason, Greta the housekeeper, who had been invited on Sophie's specific insistence because Sophie had decided she was family adjacent, 2 girls from Sophie's class who had become something approximating friends over the winter term, and Mrs. Petrakis from down the hall in Cole's building, who had been brought by Mason under somewhat ambiguous authorization. "I didn't exactly invite her," Mason told Cole quietly when Mrs. Petrakis arrived with a wrapped gift and a tin of cookies she'd made herself. "I mentioned the party, and she mentioned wanting to come, and I didn't say no." "That's inviting her," Cole said. "It's a gray area." Sophie, who had overheard this, said, "It's fine." She brought cookies. Then to Mrs. Petrakis, "Thank you for coming. The cardboard city is in the living room if you want to see it." Mrs. Petrakis, who was 71 and had the specific unflappable quality of someone who has been surprised by everything and is no longer derailable, said she would love to see the cardboard city and followed Sophie into the living room, with the cooperative ease of someone who understood that she had been assigned a role and intended to perform it well. The party was chaotic in the good way. The 2 school friends were loud, in the manner of children who have recently discovered each other and are testing the range of their combined energy. Mason was explaining the remote control car's technical specifications to Greta, who was either genuinely interested or performing interest with professional dedication, and Mrs. Petrakis was being given a formal tour of the cardboard city by Sophie, who was narrating the development history with the precision of a docent who considers accuracy non-negotiable. Harper stood in the kitchen, making the kind of assessment she'd learned to make, not managing, just watching, looking for the tightness in Sophie's shoulders that would indicate overwhelm was approaching, looking for the hand-on-table signal or the slight change in breathing. Sophie's shoulders were loose. She was gesturing at the residential district and explaining to Mrs. Petrakis about the structural decisions behind the roof pitch, and her voice had the easy authority it only had when she was talking about something she loved. Cole appeared beside Harper. He'd been helping with the cake, which he'd volunteered to handle and had managed adequately except for the lettering, which looked like it had been written by someone in a moving vehicle. "The writing on the cake," Harper said. "It says Happy Birthday, Sophie." "It says Happy Birthday, Soflo. It's legible, it's creative." Cole looked at the cake. "The structural foundation is sound. That's what matters." Harper looked at him. He had a small amount of frosting on his right wrist that he hadn't noticed. She thought about pointing it out and then didn't. "Sophie's going to say that. That's exactly what she's going to say." "Good," Cole said. "She should. Sophie came into the kitchen to inspect the cake and looked at the lettering for a long moment. Structural foundation is sound, she said. That's what matters. Cole looked at Harper. Harper put her face in her hands. What? Sophie said. It's true. We know, Cole said. That's why it's funny. Sophie looked between them, the specific look of someone who knows they've walked into something and is deciding how much to engage with it. She decided not to engage. She took a strawberry from the fruit bowl and went back to Mrs. Petrakis. Harper lifted her face from her hands. Cole was looking at the cake with the almost smile. The frosting was still on his wrist. Cole, she said.
Yeah.
She handed him a dish towel and pointed at his wrist. He looked at it, cleaned it off, handed the towel back. Their hands were briefly both on the towel again, the same as in the kitchen 3 months ago, and the time before that, and the time before that. And Harper had started to understand that these brief overlapping moments were their version of something she didn't have a word for yet, which was fine because some things developed language only after they'd become real enough to need it. I'm glad you stayed, she said. Not just tonight. Not just the party. Cole held her gaze for a moment in the way he did when he was deciding how much of a thing to say. I didn't plan to, he said, which was honest and was also, somehow, the right answer. I know, Harper said. She turned back to the counter to light the candles. The night of the party, after the guests had gone, and Mason was asleep on the couch because Cole had decided not to wake him, and Greta had cleaned the kitchen with the efficient finality of someone closing a chapter, Harper came into the living room and found Sophie sitting at the edge of the cardboard city in her pajamas. She sat down beside her. Sophie was looking at the residential district. At the small row of houses with their different roof lines and different doors, the wire and tissue trees, the small figures standing outside the house with the crooked blue door. I've been thinking, Sophie said. About what? The city needs a school, Sophie said. There are all these houses and all these people and nowhere for the kids to go during the day. Harper looked at the city. That's a significant construction project.
I know.
Sophie picked up a piece of scrap cardboard that was sitting near the edge, the way scraps always accumulated at the city's perimeter, the raw material of whatever came next. I was thinking the school could be near the residential district, so the kids don't have to go too far. That makes sense, Harper said. Sophie turned the cardboard in her hands. I was also thinking, she said, more carefully, about the figures. Harper waited, the ones in the plaza. Sophie looked at them, the original figure with the cardboard cap, the mom figure with the matchbook briefcase. There's room for more. Harper looked at the plaza. There was room. There had always been room. I think Mason should have one, Sophie said. In the plaza, not just his house. The houses are where you live. Plaza is, she paused, looking for the right word with the particular focus she gave to precision. The plaza is where you belong. That's a good distinction, Harper said. Sophie looked at her sideways, checking something. I was also thinking, she said and stopped. Sophie. There could be one more, Sophie said, quickly, the way you say something you've been holding for a while and have decided to release. In the plaza, between the cap one and the mom one. She looked at the cardboard in her hands. That's okay. Harper looked at the plaza, at the two figures already there, at the space between them. I think that would be exactly right, Harper said. Sophie nodded, with the decisive finality she brought to structural decisions. I'll make it tomorrow, she said. I want to get the details right. It needs to look like him. She set the cardboard down carefully at the city's edge, saving it, marking it as belonging to something, and stood up and smoothed her pajamas and looked at the city, one more time the way she always did before leaving it. Comprehensive survey of someone responsible for a thing they care about. Good night, Mom, she said. Good night, Harper said. Sophie went down the hallway. Harper heard her door close, not quite all the way Sophie slept now door not quite latched, because the world outside it was not something she needed to shut out anymore. Harper sat alone at the edge of the cardboard city. She looked at the two figures in the plaza. She looked at the space between them. She looked at the residential district with its row of careful houses, each one slightly different, each one built by someone who had learned that the differences were the point. She looked at the river made of cellophane running down the center of everything, the bridge across it that had been wrong the first time and right the second time. She looked at the buildings that had been built and rebuilt and reinforced and corrected, the entire imperfect, growing, living city that had been, from the beginning, about something other than cardboard. Cole was asleep on the chair in the corner he'd sat down after helping clean up, and Mason had asked him something, and he'd answered. And then Mason had been asleep, and then, without meaning to, so had Cole, the way adults fall asleep at the end of long days when they've stopped fighting it. He looked, asleep in the chair, like a different version of himself than the one she'd first seen on the hallway floor 11 months ago. Not softer exactly, Cole was not a soft person, and never would be, but more present. Less like someone who had decided to make do with a smaller life, and more like someone who had found that the small life he'd been building was actually the right size. Harper sat with that for a while. She thought about James, which she did every day, and which was easier than it had been, and still sometimes was not easy at all, which was the honest shape of grief and not something she expected to fully resolve. She thought about James saying she worried too much, and Sophie saying the same thing, and the continuity in that the way people we've loved persist in the people who come after them, in the phrases and the gestures and the particular angle of a gaze. She thought about what Sophie had said in the auditorium, about buildings and foundations and the structures that last, not because they were never damaged, but because someone paid attention to them. She thought about the fact that Cole Barrett had paid attention to Sophie, to Mason, to the space between what he said and what he left room for other people to say, to the Tuesday and Thursday afternoons that had become the architecture of something none of them had planned. She thought about a man who had come to her door 6 months before she knew she needed him, and who had sat on her hallway floor and waited, because he understood that the most important thing you can do for a frightened person is let them know that the waiting is not conditional. She had spent 2 years trying to solve Sophie, trying to find the right specialist, the right program, the right approach. She had brought intelligence and resources and genuine love to the problem, and it had not been enough. And she had not understood why until she understood that Sophie wasn't a problem. Sophie was a person who needed to be in proximity to other people who were also, honestly and imperfectly, trying to figure out how to carry the things they were carrying. That was it. It was embarrassingly simple. It was also not simple at all, because knowing what something is and being able to do it are different competencies, and Harper was still working on the second one. But she was working on it. Cole shifted in the chair. His eyes opened halfway, the particular alertness of someone who had trained himself to come awake quickly and was now slowly untraining it into something more ordinary. He looked at Harper. "Hey," he said, the way he'd said it in the hallway 11 months ago. The same word, the same voice, a completely different weight. "Hey," Harper said. He looked at Mason asleep on the couch, did the brief parent assessment, concluded all was well. Looked at the cardboard city, looked at Harper. "Good party," he said. Sophie said the writing on the cake was structurally sound. "She's right. You're both impossible," Harper said. Cole almost smiled. "Sophie said she's building a school next. She told me." Harper looked at the city. She said the plaza needs more figures. Cole was quiet for a moment. He had understood immediately. "Yeah," he said. "She wants to get the details right," Harper said. She said it needs to look like him. Cole looked at the space in the plaza between the two figures, and something moved across his face that was not the controlled stillness he usually maintained, something more unguarded. He looked at for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "She's something else. That kid." "She really is," Harper said. "She gets it from her father." Pause. "And she's getting other things from other people. I've noticed." Cole looked at her. The apartment was quiet, Mason's breathing, the city's presence, the last of the birthday evening, settling into the specific stillness that follows a good day. Outside, Seattle was doing what it did the water in the mountains and the lit grid of a city that had no opinion about what happened inside any particular apartment, on any particular floor. The indifferent backdrop against which small and significant things occurred without the city noticing or needing to. "Cole," Harper said. "Yeah." She looked at him with the directness she'd inherited from no one and developed herself, the directness that had built a company and raised a daughter, and sat on a hallway floor with her keys in her hand, trying to understand what she was seeing. "I'm glad you didn't take the job," she said, "when I offered it. I'm glad you said no." He waited. Because if you'd taken it, you'd have been the person I hired. And instead you're... She looked at the city, at the space in the plaza. Something else. Cole was quiet for a long time. Long enough that it wasn't uncomfortable. Just his way, the deciding pause. The honest consideration. I didn't think this was where I'd end up, he said. When I took the night shift here, where did you think you'd end up? Getting through, he said simply. That was the plan. Get through. Take care of Mason. Figure out the rest later. And now? He looked at the city again. At the houses in the residential district. At the plaza. He looked at Harper. Now I think later got here faster than I expected, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was exactly what it was, an honest man saying an honest thing about where he stood. Without ornamentation, without the glossy language that people use when they want to make something sound more certain than it is. Harper had spent enough time around Cole Barrett to understand that this was, from him, the most valuable kind of thing. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They sat with the cardboard city between them and the sleeping children nearby and the quiet apartment around them, and the night was ordinary and complete. The cardboard figure Sophie made for the plaza took her 3 afternoons. She used heavier stock than she'd used for. The others found a piece of mat board at the bottom of the supply drawer, the kind that held its shape without tape reinforcement. She measured it twice before cutting, which was new. She used to trust her eye, but she'd been thinking about precision lately, about how the difference between a good structure and a lasting one was often the measurements you took before you started rather than the corrections you made after. She drew the face carefully. The cap, of course, the cap, rendered in fine marker with 8 small lines at the crown for the button stitches. The jacket with the small bleach mark near the collar that she'd noticed months ago and filed away the way she filed things that mattered without knowing yet why. She made him slightly taller than the other figures in the plaza, which was accurate, and she gave him the particular posture he had when he was sitting, rather than standing way back, relaxed, the posture of someone who was planning to stay. She placed him in the plaza on a Thursday afternoon, on the empty ground between the mom figure and the cap figure. Then she added one more detail. She went to the materials drawer and found a very small piece of stiff paper and a fine point marker, and she made a tiny sign, no larger than her thumbnail, and she placed it at the figure's feet. Cole came in at 1 o'clock and saw her crouched over the plaza and came to sit at his usual edge of the city and looked at what she'd done. He looked at the new figure. He looked at the posture and the cap and the jacket. He looked at the tiny sign at the figure's feet. Sophie was watching him with the focused expression she used when she'd made something and wanted to know if it was right. He read the sign for staying. He looked at it for a long time. Sophie reached into the supply pile and brought out a new piece of cardboard. I was thinking the school should go over here, she said, pointing to the eastern section near the residential district. Close to the houses, but with its own plaza, a smaller one. Cole looked at the figure one more time. Then he looked at Sophie. His eyes were full in the way eyes get when something has landed somewhere that was not defended, and he didn't try to manage it, which was the right thing. Show me where, he said. Sophie moved to the eastern section and started explaining her vision for the school, the courtyard. The layout, the way the entrance should face the main plaza, so there was a sight line between them. Because in a good city, the important places could see each other. Cole listened and nodded and picked up his marker. They started building. Harper found them still there when she came home at 5:30, both on the floor, the school's foundation taking shape in the eastern section. Mason arrived at 6 because he'd taken the bus to Winslow Tower directly from track practice, which had become a Thursday routine without anyone formally establishing it as one. He dropped his backpack, surveyed the new construction, offered 3 structural opinions, had 2 of them rejected by Sophie on technical grounds, and accepted the 3rd being incorporated as a significant personal victory. Greta made dinner because Cole had been the Thursday cook for 3 months, and this particular Thursday he'd been on the floor building a cardboard school, and nobody had redirected him toward the kitchen, which Greta considered a reasonable state of affairs. They ate at the table, all 4 of them, plus Greta, who sometimes sat for the last 10 minutes of dinner and considered it earned, and the table was too loud and the pasta was slightly oversalted, and Mason told a long story about track practice that had a complicated middle and Inconclusive ending, and Sophie interrupted twice to improve the narrative structure, which Mason allowed while loudly complaining about. Harper sat at the head of the table that had felt enormous for 2 years and looked at the people filling it and felt the specific mixture of gratitude and grief and ordinary human gladness that is the texture of a life that has been genuinely lived. Rather than managed, that contains loss and continuation simultaneously, that is not resolved but is, improbably, and really good. Cole caught her looking and she didn't look away. Mason was still telling his story. Sophie had started a parallel critique of the story's structure. Greta was refilling water glasses. The table was full. Outside, the rain had started again, the reliable Seattle rain, the rain that had been on the windows the night. Cole sat on the hallway floor. The rain Sophie heard from the conservatory, the rain they built a bridge against and a river out of, the rain that had simply kept coming through all of it, through the loss and the cardboard and the slowly accumulating evidence that some structures hold. It kept coming now, pressing against the 45th floor windows, the way it always had and always would, indifferent and constant, the backdrop to a story it didn't know it was part of. Inside, someone passed the bread. Someone asked for the salt. Someone groaned about the pasta, and someone else defended it, and someone said the school's courtyard needed a fountain, and someone said cardboard fountains didn't work, and someone said that was defeatist thinking, and the evening went on, imperfect and loud and real, the way evenings do when they belong to people who have decided, without formally deciding, to stay.